To start, I have to establish something. The angle that I'm viewing Star Wars from. I don't think I'm wrong in saying everybody views Star Wars, and any media for that matter, in very different ways. And I think this is why we all have so much trouble talking about what makes something really good or really bad. There's a lot of people who watch Star Wars for the lore. They love the planets, the species, the ships, the history of it all, and they want to know all the details. Then there's people who watch it just for entertainment. And we all do this, of course, but I'm saying exclusively for entertainment. These are the people that are typically less critical because they're just there to turn their brains off and have fun, which is totally fair. There's literally nothing wrong with that. Then there's also people who watch Star Wars for the story. They are there to be entertained, but they're not just there to be entertained. Usually because they really passionately and deeply connect with the narrative. Again, this isn't a better or worse way to view something, it's just a way. Working under that idea that everybody watches Star Wars for different reasons, it's a lot easier to make a solid and true case about the franchise. If I said that I love Star Wars just because it's entertaining and then said they should never stop making Star Wars movies, how could you really argue with that? It's what I'd want, and that would be fair. If I said I love Star Wars for the lore and then said I can't stand certain movies and shows because of their contradictions, that would also be fair. So when I say that what I love the most about Star Wars is the story, and not even just that broadly, but that what I love the most is the core intended narrative of the Skywalker story, then you have to look at my arguments from that angle. And that's the angle I'm taking with this video, because that's how I, personally, view Star Wars. So if you are a super fan of the Star Wars lore and knowing everything about it, then, that's great. But this video probably isn't for you. And if you just watch Star Wars to be entertained and only to be entertained, then, that's great. But this video also probably isn't for you either. I'm trying really hard not to sound pretentious and be all, oh, I appreciate the authentic narrative of Star Wars and that makes me better than you, because I'm not saying that, I promise. I'm just trying to say there are different ways of approaching a piece of art, and that the angle you take to comment on a piece of art matters. Because technically, you can make a case from one viewpoint and be right every time, but you can't make that same case across all views and be right every time. And this is why I'm going to be pretty blunt about all the points I make in this video. When you argue from a very specific viewpoint, like saying, I am watching Star Wars for the original intended Skywalker narrative, there will be clear-cut objective things you can establish, and they will just be true from that standpoint, no matter what anyone may personally think. So, that is the official stance that I'll be making all my claims from in this video. I think that Star Wars, despite many huge flaws, is at its best when it is just the original intended Skywalker story told or overseen by George Lucas, and that everything that did not include him in some capacity, or that ventured beyond the original, core, intended narrative, has almost exclusively made the story worse, and that when trying to enjoy and preserve that original Star Wars story, there are a lot of gaping problems and things that either need fixed, or are better left completely omitted. It's not really the most concise or simple way to put that, is it? I guess essentially I am arguing from the perspective of the core intended Skywalker story. So from here on out, in this video, view everything I say under that umbrella. And man, I hope I'm making sense. If you're still watching, thank you. Pretty much immediately, almost everyone has heard a lot of what there is to say about the problems with Star Wars, when speaking broadly at least. There's an infinity of issues, but these three here are what I consider to be some of the most prominent. Firstly, the insane canon and lore that is filled to the brim with nonsensical, crazy problems and holes. Secondly, the quality of every entry in the Star Wars universe varies wildly. And third, the scale of many entries in Star Wars is completely messed up. Let's start off with the canon and the lore. And don't forget the stance I'm taking here. I'm talking about how the canon and lore affects the story, as someone who is primarily here for the story. So then let's establish something that is just true, straight up. Everything included in a given entry of a story should all make sense within itself and be explained to the right degree within itself. Most of us have heard the whole, oh, you would understand that part of the movie if you read the novel excuse, but, we all know that's crap. At no point ever should part of a movie only make sense if you then go and read a book. The movie should make sense, on its own. We all know this. And this goes every direction, because no book should require you to also watch a movie to make sense. Individual entries in a series of the same medium are allowed to let other entries in the same series explain something, but not out of the same medium and not out of the same series. Empire Strikes Back doesn't need to explain what a lightsaber is and why Luke has it. A New Hope did that. Same series, same medium. However, Clone Wars can't get away with not telling us how Maul escaped from Sidious just because it happened in a spin-off comic book. Different series, different medium. Yes, it's all technically Star Wars, but we all know there are individual series within the umbrella of Star Wars. Like, it's a problem that Mando and Grogu reunite in a different show than the one their story is primarily being told on, because at no point were we informed that we should go watch Boba Fett to understand Mandalorian. It's not clear. It's a different series. If you're going to pull something like this, it has to be pretty explicitly set up, kind of like how Marvel is doing it. Started with only movies, but eventually branched out to include TV, and whether you do or don't want to keep up with all the shows, it's at least made pretty obvious that if you skip out on the shows, you'll be skipping out on some plot progression and necessary information. The movies and TV shows are different mediums, but at least it's clear you need both. Basically, sometimes it can be done well, and other times it's done very poorly. Star Wars is doing it poorly. No matter how much you love the lore and the canon, we should all be able to agree that the relevant information for each entry or series of entries should be explained well enough within that entry or series of entries. Man, that was a lot. To make an attempt to bring this point home, here's a question. Have you, person watching this video, ever sat down and showed Star Wars to someone you know? Someone who knew virtually nothing about it? Because I just did that recently, and it is very eye-opening. I recently watched through the core Star Wars story with my girlfriend, who knew absolutely, literally, not a single damn thing about any of it. I'm not even kidding in the slightest when I say that the only thing she knew was that Anakin Skywalker was Darth Vader. She knew nothing about the Grand Conclusion, Palpatine being Sidious, Order 66, nothing, none of it. And I got to watch it all with her and experience it, in a way, through her eyes. And I'll just say that I highly recommend this to anyone who's a fan of anything. Sitting there with a parent, a friend, a partner, or whatever, who is experiencing a movie or show you really like, will genuinely open your eyes in a lot of ways. If the thing you're watching holds up, you will find yourself loving it even more than you did before. And if it doesn't hold up, trust me, you'll feel it, and you'll know. When I watched Star Wars with my girlfriend, it really helped me see it all in a new light. I feel like a lot of us, myself included, are so ingrained in the franchise and the story and the lore that we can honestly be pretty blind. I absolutely adore Clone Wars and still do, it holds up, but a lot of things stuck out in my last watch, both big and small, that I either couldn't justify or just never noticed before. For example, my girlfriend was surprised to see that Savage Opress had force powers, which I realized I've never questioned and isn't properly explained at all. I'm sure there's a made-up reason in lore, but it doesn't really matter. Clone Wars didn't explain it well, and that's an issue. As is what I mentioned earlier with Maul escaping Sidious's clutches. That's a pretty massive thing to leave to a comic book, regardless of the behind-the-scenes reason it happened. Telling my girlfriend before we started the final 4 episodes, oh yeah, by the way, Maul escaped and you'll never get to know what Sidious was talking about unless you read a comic book, was honestly a pretty lame moment. It's stuff like that that a lot of us fans are already so used to that we don't always recognize the issues that we probably should. The simple truth is that Star Wars has tons and tons and tons of these kind of issues, and it only gets worse the further in you go. The second point I mentioned is very quick to address, and I'm also going to come back and elaborate on it more later. Star Wars varies wildly in its quality. It quite literally ranges from a movie largely considered to be one of the best of all time, all the way to one largely considered to be one of the worst. If you try to sit down and enjoy all of Star Wars, it's going to be immensely difficult because the vast majority of this stuff is either shockingly mediocre or just bad. There are very few standout gems. Moving on to my third point, let's establish another thing that is just true. The importance of each part of a story should be directly related to its size, which, in the case of movies and shows, is runtime. When you sit down to read a book, you expect each act to be a certain length. You expect important bits to get a lot of attention, and unimportant stuff to be relatively quick. It'd be pretty weird to have a story with like a 500-page long first act, and then just 20 pages for Act 2, and then 20 more for Act 3. And it'd be pretty weird if in the middle of the story, there was an entire chapter dedicated to, like, some main character just eating a granola bar, and then it's never brought up or talked about ever again. That's intentionally a stupid example, but I mean, it's literally what's happening with Star Wars. After Disney purchased the franchise, none of these things get scaled appropriately anymore. The original trilogy are all, obviously, movies, and they stand as the most important events in the entire Star Wars story, and therefore they set the standard for scale. If they made a movie then called Owen Lars Goes Shopping and made it a 2-hour-long film like the others, that'd be really weird, especially when you go back and watch the whole franchise. Because why would such an insignificant event be given so much time as the mainline stories? But this is what Rogue One is, and this is what Solo is. When you're trying to just enjoy and appreciate the core intended Star Wars narrative, these movies make it feel pretty poorly paced and just disrupt the entire flow. Every Star Wars movie is its own individual story, each comprising a part of a series. But what is a series if not one big story? That's literally just exactly what it is. So when somebody sits down and says, hey, I want to watch the Star Wars story in its entirety, that Star Wars story is a complete entity. So it should be treated like any other story. I think it's pretty ridiculous when people complain about something like the Canto Bight scene in The Last Jedi and how it's filler and it wastes time and all that. But then they go and watch the entire Star Wars narrative and they include stuff like Rogue One and Solo. And I know the solution to this problem is exactly what everybody always says. Just don't watch it if you don't like it. And yeah, that's literally what I'm saying. I did say in this video's title that there's a way to fix Star Wars, and this is going to be a part of it. If you're someone who loves all the extensive lore or just wants as much Star Wars content as you can get, then of course, enjoy the hell out of Rogue One and enjoy the hell out of Solo. I don't care. But if you're someone that wants to experience the core Star Wars narrative, paced well and without any extra weight, then not watching those two films, plus a lot of the other stuff, is exactly what I'm going to be suggesting here. Omitting movies, shows, and as I'll explain later, even certain scenes, is a massive part of how to fix Star Wars. It feels like it should be obvious, and maybe I shouldn't have even included this part of the video, but I don't know, I see and hear a lot of people complaining about the current state of Star Wars and how fundamentally broken it is, when most of the solution is as simple as just watching certain things and pretending others don't exist. Just because Disney made a show doesn't mean you have to consider it part of the franchise you love. And with that, I have said just about everything I have to say about the broader issues with Star Wars. Everything else I want to say kind of just boils down to the good and the bad of each individual entry and how they all affect each other. So I'm literally just gonna talk about every single movie and show in Star Wars, and eventually that'll bring me to my final conclusions about the state of the core Star Wars story, and, how best to fix it. It's going to take me a little while, but I think going through the entire franchise is the best way to give the conclusions I'm eventually going to draw their proper justice.
May the Force be with you in Star Wars.
Starting off, we have a movie that has been out for so long that there is basically nothing new to say about it. Seriously, what is there to say that every person on YouTube hasn't already heard? Even me mentioning that it's already been said a million times has already been said a million times. So I'm going to try and keep it short. Basically, this movie is incredible. You know that. Everybody knows that. Despite some janky editing choices and some tiny overlooked mistakes, this movie stands as one of the greatest movies in just history. As it was seen in theaters, what else is there to say? It's a phenomenal entry in the larger Star Wars story and the only episode that can stand on its own. The main issues that do exist with this movie, though, exist in its current state. The goddamn special edition for this movie is the worst, which, once again, everybody already knows. Or at least I thought everybody knew, but then I read a bunch of comments on my last video where people were defending the special editions just because they came from the mind of George Lucas. And so with that, it is time to establish another big thing that I want everyone to keep in mind for this entire video. And, I mean, what we should be keeping in mind when talking about any story ever. An artist does not always understand their own work. So while yes, George Lucas is the original creator of Star Wars and holds all of it in his brain, it doesn't mean that he always knows what's best for his own story. I feel like Ridley Scott and what he did to Blade Runner is the perfect example of this. This movie is a masterpiece. It's awesome. He told an almost perfect story exploring what it means to be alive, intentionally using a human character and a replicant, which, if you don't know, is basically just a robot. That was the whole point of the movie, contrasting a person with a machine. That's why it worked. That's why it was interesting. But somewhere, later down the line, Ridley Scott decided that actually it'd be a pretty cool twist if the human character was just also a replicant, which wrecks the whole thing. It destroys almost all of the depth this movie had and makes it pretty much pointless. But Ridley Scott, being in charge, made sure that the final cut was released, which, while still the best way to experience this movie, has a scene that confirms both these characters are replicants, which, like I said, messes everything up. It was interesting because of the human and replicant contrast. That was what the movie was about. And if you want to argue that because it's Ridley Scott and it's his vision and he gets the final say, cool, I guess, you can think that, but it blatantly demonstrates a misunderstanding of what he himself made in the first place. This is all to say that just because someone made a story, it doesn't mean they always get to their own work, or even that they always know what's best for it. And so if I, or anyone, say that we prefer a certain version of this movie or any movie, that's totally fine, and we're not going against the true vision of George Lucas or whatever. Because, also, can't it be said that the people who would say something like that also aren't respecting the original vision of George Lucas? At what point does the creator of a story stop knowing what's best for their own work? Do we trust today's George more, or the George from the 70s more? Because at a certain point, a movie is done being made. At a certain point, any piece of art is done being made. So when people say the special editions wreck too much of the original, they just love the original piece of art. The thing the creator made at the time and thought a certain way about at the time. The thing that they decided was done at the time. It doesn't feel fair for him to come back years later and decide to alter significant parts of it. What version of Lucas do we let dictate the state of this movie? Because not every addition to this film is bad, but not every addition is good either. Like, really, what if he came back in a decade and added a 20-minute scene of Boba Fett dancing on the Death Star? Would that count as the true vision just because he made it? Do we respect the creator coming back just to add goofy shenanigans to their movie just because they created the story in the first place? Does it make sense why I think this whole argument is kind of dumb? Just, basically, if anybody likes the special editions, awesome. Parts of them are good. If anybody likes the original, awesome. They're great. Anyway, whatever. Getting back to it, this movie is awesome. It's great. I love it. I'm moving on. So after episode 4, this movie was released. This movie is also basically perfect. I feel like every time I watch it, I completely forget how good it is, and I appreciate it even more than the last time. Great story, great music, great cinematography, great everything. It's amazing. The only additional thing I'll say about it is that this movie demonstrates how I was saying that sometimes changes can be good and benefit a story. I don't know anyone that prefers the original Emperor in this movie. This change doesn't mess anything up about the larger narrative or the movie itself, and it just cleans up a little inconsistency. That's great. That's how these changes should be. Anyway, great movie. Moving on.
Return of the Jedi. Coming to a selected theater in your galaxy.
Now, this is where things start to get a bit rough. This movie is good. Very good. But I wouldn't say it's great. Parts of it are great, some parts are even phenomenal. It contains some of the best scenes of the entire series, but unfortunately, those scenes aren't quite enough. Speaking very broadly, it's pretty apparent this movie is a step down from the previous two, and keep in mind I'm saying this as someone who genuinely loves this film. The music and cinematography are still awesome, but the acting is just a little worse, and the pacing is dramatically worse. There's a distinct lack of energy in this movie that just feels very off, and as I'm sure many can attest to, it ends up feeling very sleepy. For what is the finale of a trilogy, and now what exists as the finale of an entire saga, it just doesn't carry that conclusive weight that a finale typically should. I feel like when you start watching the final entry in any series, you can always just kind of tell, even if you didn't know beforehand, that it's the end. Two films that I think do this really, really great are John Wick Chapter 4 and then Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 2. The opening couple seconds of Deathly Hallows have such a palpable sense of closure and finality that just continues to seep into the entire rest of the movie. It's the end of the series, and as such, it has an appropriately grand yet somber feeling the whole way through. And John Wick Chapter 4 is an absolutely perfect example of this. I went into this movie literally completely blind, not knowing if it was the finale or not, but it became pretty obvious pretty early on. The previous 3 movies held a tone that was like really energetic, and they always felt like they were continuing to just go, 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 but Chapter 4, in its first few scenes, feels somber and reflective. Some very big things happen very quickly that indicate there's no messing around in this movie, and the conversations characters have, as well as the entire way that Wick behaves and talks in the movie, is that of finality. The movie is very much about acceptance, and specifically acceptance of death, and it is just blatantly clear that we have arrived at the end. Tons of stories do this. Avatar's finale carries this weight, as does Breaking Bad, BoJack Horseman, Adventure Time, Avengers Endgame, and just so many more. I'm not saying that Return of the Jedi absolutely needed to have such a strong sense of finality the whole way through, but I don't think it's really a good thing that it barely had any. And even more so, it's not great that it doesn't have much of an energy to it at all. The length of each act and the beats it chooses to dwell on really make it feel like it's dragging, which, at least in my opinion, a finale should not do. The first act is a perfect example of everything I've been talking about. And I'm not talking about the scene at the second Death Star, that's mostly great. I'm talking about the Jabba stuff. Not only is the Jabba's palace bit overly long, but it doesn't feel at all like saga-concluding material. Everything contained within the rescue of Han Solo is very fun and enjoyable to watch, for the most part, but there's just too much to it. Opening with C-3PO and R2 is great, it's awesome. Having 2 pretty helpless characters introduce us to this strange and creepy new location is a fantastic way to start out. It's the same reason the first act of A New Hope works so well. But then Leia and Chewie show up, and they get captured, and it's like, okay, cool. And then Luke shows up, and gets captured, and it's like, what is happening? Is this part of the plan? And it's all been very fun to watch and everything, but, I mean, come on, this is 30 minutes into the movie already. 30 entire minutes into the final film of the Star Wars saga, and they haven't even rescued Han yet. Then it just keeps getting more crazy, because we're still in the first act, but we've completely switched locations and are now all the way out in the desert on all these barges and skiffs. And again, this is all very, very, very cool. It's all very fun to watch, but why are we this far into the movie? Into the finale of the saga? And obviously there's the whole thing of Luke's plan making no sense and how it could have gone wrong a million different ways at any time, but I honestly don't care about any of that. Yes, it is a genuine flaw, but I think how dragged out all this is a much worse flaw. So by the time we get through this entire bit of rescuing Han, we are officially almost 40 whole minutes into the movie. Almost a third of the entire movie was dedicated to this stuff. I think this would be pretty forgivable if the second act wasn't arguably worse, because not only does the second act also not feel like finale material, but it also loses all the exciting energy of the whole trilogy. And another crime, arguably on the same level, is the second Death Star, which is pretty lame. Us Star Wars fans really like to shit on the Rise of Skywalker and how its opening title crawl just declares that Sidious came back with 0 setup in any of the previous movies, but come on, the second Death Star is the same type of thing. Not quite as bad, but still really bad. Nothing in the previous 2 movies, or the prequels for that matter, ever even came remotely close to teasing the idea of a second one of these things. But just like in The Rise of Skywalker, we have an opening title crawl that just throws a massive piece of information at us that is very poorly set up, and also pretty unbelievable. I've been of the opinion for quite some time that it would have been a better move to just make this story be about the rebels trying to get aboard, like, Palpatine's personal Star Destroyer or something, and that they want to kill him and take all the other Imperial leaders out, and that's how they win the war. Making it a second Death Star cheapens A New Hope and asks the audience to suspend their disbelief just a little too much. It also leads to a very similar, yet worse, final space battle in the third act. But going back to the second act, this stuff is genuinely just baffling. The previous 2 films hit us with adventure after adventure after adventure all across these awesome places, and always with such a strong energy and sense of tension and excitement and action. But as soon as we get to Endor, it feels like all the momentum is just gone. Our heroes are on an explicitly time-sensitive mission that only they can achieve, but at no point do they ever act like it. It starts off pretty strong with them checking out this cool new moon, running into some Imperials, and having a very exciting chase scene, but then they get separated and bump into the Ewoks, and it's just like, none of this is necessarily bad, but just Come on, this is the final chapter of the entire Star Wars saga. Think about how you were feeling halfway into Deathly Hallows, or halfway into John Wick Chapter 4, or halfway into the Avatar finale. None of that kind of energy is here. It just feels like a random side quest that none of our main characters even particularly care about. And then we've got the Ewoks, which on their own are very fun, but not only are they in this movie for way too long, but they kind of destroy any last hope there was for a sense of finality in this second act. None of it feels like a finale. The first scene that feels like it belongs in a proper conclusion to Star Wars is when C-3PO tells the story of their adventures to the Ewoks. It's a fun little recap of the previous movies and does genuinely create a small air of finality. And then right after this, we start to enter the third act as Luke finally confronts Darth Vader. And this is great, but my god, we are now an hour and 20 minutes into this movie. There is less than an hour remaining, and Return of the Jedi only now starts to feel like the final chapter in a trilogy. Thankfully, though, almost everything from here on out is pretty fantastic. Every single moment with Luke, Vader, and the Emperor is borderline perfect, and it does feel like the best climax the saga could have received. These scenes are the reason why I think this movie works, and why I still love it. There's a lot of dicking around up until this point, but once Return of the Jedi finally arrives at its third act, specifically the scenes on the second Death Star, it absolutely delivers. It feels like a finale. It feels like the end of a long story we've been building towards. I mean, just these scenes alone hold 100 times more finale power than anything else in the rest of this movie. It's great, it's awesome, I love this stuff. The other two parts of this final act, though, are a little bit iffy. The attack on the second Death Star, despite its existence being kind of stupid, is appropriately exciting in all the right ways. I just think that the timing of it is a little bit wrong. The true climax of this movie is everything happening in the throne room, and the final conversation between Luke and Vader. So it's a bit weird to have the movie give us near complete emotional fulfillment, just to pull us away from all that to watch Lando blow up another Death Star. Which obviously is almost exactly like the last time this happened, just worse, and we didn't even get as much time establishing it as a threat or anything. This is why I advocate for the finale just being on Palpatine's ship or something, because then the climax can start and end with him, and there's no need to pull away from the two main characters of the entire saga finding closure to see this. But, of course, these issues pale in comparison to the last piece of the third act, the Ewoks fighting the Stormtroopers. And I'm just gonna say it, this is the worst part of this movie. From the perspective of the larger Star Wars story, this is just true. I genuinely cannot fathom why anyone thought it was a good idea to have the primary antagonist's army lose horribly to teddy bears. Even ignoring the blatant things like why are their weapons even remotely effective and where did all these Home Alone traps come from, the fundamental issue is just that this is not a satisfying way to end a trilogy. This is not how you beat the bad guys. At the time of release, it was already pretty lame to have a trilogy conclude with this, but now to have the entire saga lead up to Ewoks beating Stormtroopers is just a level of ridiculous I cannot possibly understand. Why do more people not have a problem with this? It is genuinely one of the worst things about Star Wars. I want you to imagine now watching The Lord of the Rings: Return of the King, but instead of Aragorn recruiting the Ghost Army, he recruits Ewoks, and they save the day. Or imagine Ewoks winning the fight against Death Eaters at the Battle of Hogwarts. Or imagine Ewoks at the Battle of Ba Sing Se. Just take literally any of your favorite finales to any of your favorite stories and just drop Ewoks into the final act. And then genuinely tell me it's not stupid. It is one of the most deflating ways to close out a story I have ever seen. And to address the main argument against this very quickly, I know a lot of people say that the Ewoks were a metaphor for nature triumphing over man's evil, or a metaphor for the Viet Cong or something, and, you know, if that was the intention, that's cool and all. But let's not kid ourselves into pretending that that excuses this. Just because something is supposed to represent something else doesn't make it good. If I went and wrote the worst story ever about a guy who just wants to eat Cheetos and play Fortnite, but then included tons of nods to the modern-day political landscape or something, nobody would excuse that. Your story has to work well on its own, regardless of what it's representative of. Metaphor is just icing on the cake. Anyway, the summary to all of this is that Return of the Jedi, while very good, is deeply flawed. and its greatest failings come from its distinct lack of finale energy. There's a lot of good stuff in it, a lot of fun adventures, it ultimately sticks the landing, and everything after the destruction of the second Death Star is just beyond wonderful, but ultimately it's not what it could have been. And I think that's the suckiest part. It's not a bad movie. It's just disappointing, because I wish it were great. Now, before I jump all the way to the Phantom Menace, I'm just going to address the special edition very briefly. It's mostly fine. Some things are a little weird, but aside from 3 main changes, I don't think any of it is super dramatic. First of the 3, this song is beyond atrocious. Moving on. This little galaxy celebration montage at the end is pretty good. The more modern CGI is kind of off-putting, but overall I like what this accomplishes. After Vader's funeral, the movie honestly feels like it wraps up really fast, and only really shows us a brief celebration at the Ewok village, which is good, but I think showing more of the galaxy celebrating is a bit better, especially as a closer to an entire saga and not just a trilogy. And lastly, I think it's pretty clear that the new Victory Celebration theme is superior to Yub Nub. Nothing against the Yub Nub song, it's fantastic, it's just tonally not very fitting, especially when it's the last song of the saga, of everything that came before. Anyway, that's all I got for the original trilogy for now. Also these movies were made before the Phantom Menace, and they are very similar to the holiday special in that they were also released. Okay, so now we are stepping into some really controversial territory, even though it shouldn't be controversial at all. Before I start talking about this movie, I want to take a second to re-establish that I am primarily focused on story in this video. I am talking a bit about some other aspects of these movies just because I feel like it, but by and large, I am here to talk about the story of each of these movies and the franchise as a whole. So keep that in mind as we keep going. I also want to establish something about the way that art is judged, and maybe the way that it should be judged. There are obviously tons of people who will say things like, this movie is bad objectively, or this movie is good objectively, and that's not always fair, because objectivity is very rarely actually applicable to the things we attach it to, but at the same time, it's also very difficult to have any kind of proper discussion about a movie, show, book, or any piece of art without laying down some sort of framework. It doesn't seem fair to say that objectivity doesn't exist at all within art, and that you can't say something isn't just bad or just good, because then it can't be said that Empire Strikes Back, or whatever else, is a good movie, and that doesn't seem right. So here's how I look at it. I think one of the best ways to judge any given piece of art is with the artist's intention in mind, thinking of what they set out to accomplish, and comparing it to what they actually did accomplish. Basically, this is to say that I think we can call any movie good if the creator sets out to do a certain set of things and achieves all or most of them. And we can call any movie bad if the artist sets out to do a certain amount of things and doesn't achieve all or most of them. Exceptions obviously exist, like what about the times when someone sets out to make something but it ends up being totally different than intended and everyone loves it anyway. I don't think this breaks what I'm saying in any way though, because exceptions will always exist, to every rule, ever. There's no perfect way to judge anything, but I think this is a very solid way to. With all that in mind, I think it is very fair to say that The Phantom Menace is a bad movie, and I say this as someone who grew up loving not just this movie, but all 3 prequels. It is said all the time, but it really does seem true that the vast majority of people that like these movies only really do so because of nostalgia. I don't even really think an in-depth analysis of this movie or of the other prequels is needed to say that they are bad. As I mentioned before, if we just compare the artist's intent with what the artist achieved, it's blatantly obvious that these just aren't good films. It is irrefutable that the characters are flat, the plot makes no sense, the acting is stiff, the tone is all over the place, and the special effects have aged very poorly. And so, you have to ask, was this the intention or not? Do you believe Lucas intended to make lifeless characters? Do you believe he intended for the plot to be convoluted and filled with holes? Do you believe he intended for the acting to be so wooden, and for the tone to be so jarring, and for the special effects to not hold up with time? If you genuinely believe that all of this was intentional, then cool, yeah, you can believe this movie's good, and that's totally fair. I just think it's very clear that none of this was the goal, because why would it be? Why wouldn't Lucas be aiming to make a movie that's exciting, filled with life, visually dazzling for decades to come, and all with an airtight plot? If we assume he was trying to succeed at all of these things, and we are honest with ourselves that he really didn't, then does that not make the movie bad? And in case my argument isn't already enough, like, look at this footage.
It's a little disjointed. It seems like a lot of short scenes. it's bold in terms of jerking people around, but
in a space of about 90 seconds, you go from lamenting the death of, a hero, to escape, to slightly comedic with Jar Jar.
Boggles the mind. I mean, I've thought about this quite a bit, and the tricky part is you almost can't take any of those pieces out of there now.
It's a lot, and it's a very short time.
Because each one kind of takes you to the next place, and you can't jump. You don't know where you are. I may have gone too far in a few places.
How can anyone watch this and not realize that these movies simply are not good? If the guy who made the thing is literally admitting he messed up, and several other people who brought the story to life also appear completely disappointed in their own work, then what are we left with? If at this point you still don't feel the same way, then cool, I'm glad you love these movies. I wish I did. But I think everything I just said and put on screen is more than enough proof. If I were trying to be as direct and concise as possible with this video, I would just end my prequel talk here, but this is meant to be my big ultimate Star Wars video essay thingy, so I'm just going to keep going. It's also fun for me to just get my thoughts out. To be more positive for a moment, there is actually a lot that I love about this movie. The score is obviously phenomenal and contains one of my favorite pieces of music ever composed. Darth Maul looks cool as hell, and this fight scene is masterful. The planets we get to see are very, very cool. The underwater scene is very fun, and so is the pod race, and what I love the most about this movie is the story it intended to tell, despite how much I despise the execution. And this is where I think these movies fail the most. They legitimately could have been so much more. I genuinely believe that the story of the prequels is better than the story of the original trilogy, but that story was massively failed by terrible execution. And that sucks, because I love Star Wars and I wish it had all been great. These 3 movies really had so much potential, and nearly all of it was completely wasted, leading them to be some of the greatest disappointments in just cinematic history. It's honestly pretty crazy that so much of what this movie was trying to depict is simply not conveyed well enough for the audience to understand at all. A very simple example of this is in Qui-Gon's funeral scene, where Yoda and Mace discuss Maul. They agree that there are only ever 2 Sith, and that they don't know if they got the Master or the Apprentice. But if you think about it, the rule of 2 is literally never explained in the prequels. Yoda just says, there's always 2. But what? What do you mean? If we're not told about the rule of 2, then how does this statement sound like anything other than complete lunacy? And even if we are told this, what do you mean always 2 there are? You mean to say that Yoda is completely ruling out the possibility that a 3rd, 4th, or more Sith could exist? This is a massive assumption to jump to, an assumption that'd be weird to hear from any character, but hearing it from Yoda specifically is pretty crazy. Isn't he supposed to be super wise? This is exactly the type of stuff I was talking about before, how us Star Wars fans get so ingrained in the franchise and the lore and everything else, that when we watch these movies, we can't see the flaws in them that casual audiences would be completely confused or turned off by. And that's just a small example of this problem. One of the movie's main goals, and what's depicted in the climax, the Duel of the Fates, is to throw the outcome of Anakin's training into one lightsaber fight, to toss him up between Qui-Gon, a father figure that can raise him well and bring out the true Chosen One, and Obi-Wan, who's more of a brother, more of a friend, who won't be capable of doing everything that needs to be done to train him properly. But let's be honest and recognize that the movie pretty much never presents this to us in a way that we can understand. Most people, myself included, needed online video explanations to understand that that was the underlying goal of this duel, that was all really going on underneath. The Phantom Menace does not set Qui-Gon up as the wisest, most bestestest teacher ever for Anakin. He literally lets Anakin go do the pod race knowing full well this could happen to him, and then decides to take him to an actual war zone later. And it also doesn't really depict Obi-Wan as too inept to properly train and, in a way, father the Chosen One. He and Qui-Gon act so similar all the time, and there's just not enough contrast. And so while this is all cool information to learn later, and it does make me appreciate the story a little bit more, it doesn't change the fact that the movie fails at conveying this information to its audience properly. And this is what I'm saying sucks so much about this movie, and the other 2 prequels as well. The idea and the story concept behind it all is genius and amazing, but it just wasn't executed well. And this, combined with the long list of plot holes, the racist alien stereotypes, the wooden acting, the flat dialogue, the horribly aged CGI, the bizarre slapstick humor, the inconsistent tone, the goofiness, and complete ineptitude of the main enemy Force, and this over-the-top, unbelievable insanity that Anakin does in the third act, make this an almost irrefutably bad movie. And coupled with the damning things Lucas and his associates express about their own film, just makes any argument in favor of this movie completely pointless. There is basically no real case for this movie to be good. What's fun about Attack of the Clones is that everything I just said about The Phantom Menace just applies here too. This movie has all the same issues, is pretty much just as bad, and in many cases might actually be worse. So to start positive, there's a lot of things I do love about this movie. The music is once again amazing, a lot of actors like Ewan and Hayden are fantastic despite the script they are given, and there's lots of awesome sound design, more cool planets, more cool locations, and some really fun action sequences. The negatives, on the other hand, are overwhelming. There are once again all the same problems, tons of plot holes, terrible visual effects, flat dialogue, tonally jarring slapstick, and everything else. Plus, almost every action sequence, regardless of how fun or inventive it is, goes on like twice as long as it should, or is just pure filler. There's really not much to say that everyone else on YouTube hasn't already said a million times. So I'll just once again say that this movie had incredible ideas and an awesome story concept that was failed by horrible execution. And while I don't have a clip of Lucas outright admitting issues with his own movie this time, I don't think anyone would disagree that these two movies have pretty much the exact same flaws to them as last time. They succeed in all the same places and fail in all the same places. And so if he felt that way about the last one, why would he feel differently this time around? It once again comes down to artist intention versus artist achievement, and it's all the same as last time, so it's once again fair to say that Attack of the Clones is a bad movie. I don't actually have much to say about this series. The basic gist is that it's very, very good. There's not much to say story-wise because it's mostly a collection of shorts, but those shorts are very well done. I will, however, circle back to talk about this a little bit later, but yeah, good stuff. Very good stuff. Speaking broadly about this movie, it is a step up from the other two in a lot of regards. Once again, everybody knows this, it's not news. The CGI is substantially more impressive, the pacing is way better, and the story isn't a complete mess. It's still deeply, deeply flawed in all the same places, but not a total mess. I think this movie is probably the best example of everything that I've mentioned about how Star Wars fans get blinded to the problems in the franchise because they've been so ingrained in it. And I admit I've also been very guilty of that sometimes too. It's very complicated. I wouldn't really say that time has been kind to this movie, but rather that later entries in the franchise have been kind to this movie. Because if you pretend that only the core 6 Star Wars films exist, this movie still mostly sucks, primarily because of how insanely rushed it is. Again, literally everybody knows this, but if you ignore the stuff you know about the novelizations, the expanded universe, and especially the 2008 Clone Wars series, the story of Anakin's downfall is horribly executed. This movie essentially just shows us an Anakin who is basically a psychopath. In this movie, the only real motivators we see towards his turn to the dark side are his fear of losing Padme and what Palpatine does with that fear. His annoyance at being asked to spy on Palpatine and his denial of the rank of Master also add to this, and yeah, they're all pretty shitty things dealt to him, but are we honestly supposed to believe this is enough to make him murder tons of his fellow Jedi and literal innocent children just on a dime? Plus have him go this crazy on Obi-Wan and act like this? And I'm saying it again, but if we compare the artist's intent with the artist's results, none of this adds up. Lucas never talks about Anakin like he was some villain right from the beginning. Both the way he's talked about by the characters in the original trilogy and the way he's talked about by Lucas himself paint him as a sympathetic character who, over a long period of time, gets seduced into wrongdoing. But we aren't shown enough of that. We see none of this stuff in The Phantom Menace, and barely any of it in Attack of the Clones. Then we jump ahead really far and see a few bad things happen to him, and then this. It's not the most outlandish thing ever, but it's not all too believable either. And it doesn't really seem like Lucas was trying to make him out to be just a total creepy psycho in both episodes 2 and 3. I think it also should be acknowledged that Anakin's story, at least in the way that Lucas approached it, was just too big for a trilogy. Maybe if a lot of the stuff in these movies was revised, this could have been effectively told, but at least in the way that it was presented to us, it was just too much for 3 movies. Almost the entirety of the Phantom Menace is dedicated to showing us how Anakin was discovered and how he ended up joining the Jedi Order, which, while great to see, only leaves us with 2 movies to tell the rest of his story. And that's not a lot. The way Lucas tackled it meant that we skip years and years and years of Anakin's life, missing out on pretty much all his training, which probably would have been very helpful to see. Attack of the Clones just skips over all of that, then reintroduces him to Padme, separates him from Obi-Wan, and focuses almost exclusively on him falling in love with Padme. Which, again, is great to see, but is it really what should be eating up nearly the entirety of the second movie in this trilogy? Because now we've only got 1 more movie left, and it has to show his fall to the dark side. And so, to make that happen, Lucas skips over the entire Clone Wars, more of his training and eventual knighting, and a plethora of opportunities to depict his struggles and his growth. The massive gaps of time between these movies are just so odd, especially when compared to the time jumps between the movies in the original trilogy. Everything between A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back is completely non-essential for us as an audience to see. All we really miss is the rebels going to a different planet, but otherwise we're all good. And the time jump between Empire Strikes Back, aside from the weird bit with the second Death Star, is also a completely fine gap. We understand that the rebels went off to do something, and that Luke and Leia eventually found out where Han is. We don't need to know much more. Between episodes 4 and 5, and 5 and 6, there's no massive plot points or character changes that we completely miss. But that's not the case at all with the prequels. Every time we are reintroduced to Anakin, Obi-Wan, and Padme, they are at a totally different point in their lives than the last time we saw them. At the end of the Phantom Menace, Anakin has just gotten accepted into the Jedi Order, Obi-Wan has only just become a Jedi Knight who has to train Padawan, and Padme is the queen of her planet that she just saved. Not to mention at this point, it doesn't even seem that Anakin and Obi-Wan like each other. But then we jump to Attack of the Clones, and Anakin is like 10 years older and an established Jedi Padawan with tons of experience. Obi-Wan is much older and wiser, has clearly found his footing as a master, and Padme is no longer queen, or residing on the planet she just made a big deal out of returning to the last time we saw her. And everything that happened between these characters, specifically Anakin and Obi-Wan, who are now super chummy, just gets casually mentioned but never once seen, and all right before they get split up for almost the whole movie. And then it happens all over again with the time jump between episodes 2 and 3. Anakin and Obi-Wan are off on a crazy mission that, once they return from, Anakin declares has been super long and that he hasn't seen Padme in months. All these characters were just together, and now we're starting with this movie, reuniting them again. Anakin and Obi-Wan reunite with Padme at the beginning of both of these stories. Plus, the big ending of the last movie was that the Clone Wars were just beginning, and that was supposed to be a huge deal. But then we just skip over the entire thing and see all of none of it. Imagine if this is how the original trilogy was. Imagine if A New Hope ended with Luke and Han not liking each other, and then we skipped 10 years forward and we see them suddenly being best friends. And they just tell us that the Death Star got blown up and that it was a real fun time. It's not that you can't have massive gaps of time in between entries in a trilogy or saga, it's that these gaps leave out things that would have made the story better, things that were important and relevant. These are not the good kinds of gaps in a story. Yes, the things we did see in all 3 prequel films were important, but so was all the stuff we didn't see, which means there just wasn't enough shown to us or done well enough to make Revenge of the Sith pay off properly. This is a massive reason why it feels so rushed. So when looking at it this way, along with everything else I and many others have talked about, it's pretty clear that Revenge of the Sith story just wasn't executed well. Anakin's downfall is the entire point of this whole movie and whole trilogy, so if it doesn't get that part right, can it really be called a good movie? It's not bad, because of everything that it does do right, but because of the things it gets wrong, the things at its very core, I think it's fair to say that it's just okay. And I know I'll be hated by tons of people for just saying that, but it seems pretty true. As I said though, there is a lot of good to this movie. Revenge of the Sith has one of the greatest scores of all time, it's got some of the most beautiful imagery of all time, some astounding action sequences, and arguably the best Star Wars story concept, despite its execution. What's interesting though, is that as I said earlier, later entries in the franchise have been very, very kind to this movie. I think if we were all to remove our nostalgia goggles, ignore all the extra lore and other content we've gotten so familiar with, and treat this movie as just the 3rd movie in an isolated 6-movie saga, It's blatantly apparent that the emotional beats don't land like they should, the character dynamics don't connect properly, and there's just generally not much reason to get invested in hardly anything on screen. However, with the existence of a little show called Clone Wars, nearly every single core story issue in this movie becomes non-existent. I still stand by the fact that a story should be able to stand on its own and not need outside explanation or elaboration to make sense to its audience, but that doesn't mean that I hate fun, or that fans of something can't salvage stories they like through additional stories told in the franchise. And that's what's so special about Clone Wars. Lucas himself wanted to expand upon the story of the films and further flesh out Anakin's arc, and he oversaw all of this show. And while Clone Wars is genuinely phenomenal and can salvage Revenge of the Sith for many fans, it doesn't actually mean it makes it a better movie. Revenge of the Sith, on its own, is still the exact same level of quality with or without Clone Wars. It's still an okay movie. Clone Wars makes it so the audience can enjoy it a lot more, but it doesn't actually fix it. Anyway, I have more to say about Revenge of the Sith, but I'll say those things within the context of Clone Wars. So let's talk about that now. Before I talk about the show, I guess I should talk about the movie. Basically, it's just fine, or at least I remember it being just fine. I haven't actually seen it since it came out, and have no interest in rewatching it anytime soon, or ever. The animation is pretty bad, the plot is weird, and overall it's just pretty unremarkable. So, yeah, I guess that's all I got for that. So now I'm gonna have to really try to keep myself from rambling. Clone Wars is by far my favorite thing to come out of this entire franchise, and it's not even close. Someday later down the line, I'd even love to make a shorter video specifically about Clone Wars and why I like just it, but that's not today. This video's focus kinda has to stay on the overall story of Star Wars. I gotta keep myself focused. Basically, Clone Wars is a show that starts out pretty bad and very kiddie, but slowly evolves into the most creative, daring, deep, and mature story told in the entire Star Wars universe, at least on film, or shows, whatever you want to say. The first season is really rough. It's got unfinished animation, weird editing choices, and very few stories that bring any sort of originality to the table. Season 2 is substantially better on all fronts, and certain arcs are legitimately better than any of the prequels. Most of the first 2 seasons, regardless of quality, are still only presenting pretty standard stuff, though. Almost every episode is about clones and Jedi having to deal with droids, with the occasional bounty hunter story thrown in there. But Season 3 is the first time that Clone Wars fully shines through, putting its creativity on full display with some of the most inventive narratives in the whole franchise. And from that point on, it just gets better and better and better. Every single season is more exciting, more emotional, more mature, and more creative than the last. And all the while, the animation, music, sound, and performances just continue to get better and better and better and better. But we're really here to talk about how the Clone Wars story stands in relation to the larger story of the entire franchise. And so firstly, this show, and many others we'll talk about later, does get a pass on needing to stand alone or explain everything within itself. The original saga does not get that pass because it was clearly created and intended to be a cohesive whole all its own, without ever pointing the audience towards other stories in order to understand its material. But with things like Clone Wars, and later shows like Rebels, it's pretty apparent that you aren't meant to just jump into this without any knowledge of the franchise as a whole. This show, as directly laid out by Lucas himself, is meant to fill in the gaps between episodes 2 and 3, fleshing out the Clone Wars and the journey of the prequel trilogy's main characters. There's an understanding when you start this show that you are watching a piece of a larger whole. Hopefully, now I won't get any comments calling me a hypocrite, which probably will anyway, but I tried. The other thing to address about Clone Wars is that, yes, it's not all non-stop quality. About half of this show ranges from dull and mediocre to just flat-out bad. And yeah, that doesn't bode well for Clone Wars as a whole, but the awesome thing is that you can just easily skip all those episodes. Almost every single episode that sucks or is boring is filler. The vast majority of the actually important stuff is good, and so that's why I, and pretty much everyone else who likes the show, just recommend you use a guide of some kind to skip the lame stuff. Also, Clone Wars does contradict Revenge of the Sith in some pretty annoying ways, but I do have a solution for that, and I'll get to it later. Anyway, what makes this show so important to the larger Star Wars story is what it does to all of the characters in Revenge of the Sith. If you were to watch Revenge of the Sith without knowing anything else about Star Wars, you might have an okay time, but if you then go back and watch Clone Wars, then revisit Revenge of the Sith, it would be a completely new experience. This show is the reason that so many fans watch that movie and actually feel emotionally impacted and invested, and why they don't feel it's rushed. Let's just speedrun through these before I get too carried away. Anakin is given proper character development, growing very slowly to more dark-sided tendencies with each passing season. We see major events that make his eventual turn in Revenge of the Sith much more believable, like losing his apprentice because of the Jedi's own hypocrisy, and having his master and entire order deceive him over a simple mission. We see the adventures he goes on throughout the Clone Wars, we see his friendship with Obi-Wan, we see his friendship with Palpatine, we see his love with Padme, we see his struggles, his strength, his everything. Clone Wars brings Anakin to the point of actually being the most complex and well-written character in the entire saga, something he should have been before, but never really was. And this same treatment is applied to pretty much every other character. We are given reasons to be invested in all of these people that were just not that interesting before. And all of their character growth is attached to fantastic, rich Star Wars stories that show us so many different sides of the galaxy and the conflict within it. The struggles the clones face both in war and as individuals, the great good and terrible evil spread across all corners of the galaxy, more details about the Force that restore so much of the feeling of wonder it held in the original trilogy, the complex wrongdoings of the Jedi barely touched upon before, the beginning of the Rebel Alliance, and tons and tons and tons more. And all across so many different genres, every arc almost feeling like a mini-movie from a different creative mind, yet still all standing so consistent in tone and continuity. There's undercover spy stories, on-the-ground war stories, zombie stories, prison break stories, political stories, horror stories, and just about anything else you could think of. Not to mention all of the new characters that the show introduces and weaves in masterfully. It feels like the primary two intentions of this show are to tell the best Star Wars stories you've ever seen, and to fix everything it can about Revenge of the Sith. And the vast majority of the time, it totally succeeds at both. It actually shows us the things we needed to see in the prequels and in between the prequels. It not only deepens Revenge of the Sith, but the original trilogy too, and as a result, the entire saga. Now, there is one final thing to address before I move on to talk about the next show. Because Clone Wars was cancelled before it could tell every story it intended to tell, there are a few characters and plotlines that feel kind of forgotten by the time the last credits roll. That doesn't mean the show doesn't end well, though, because it absolutely does. The finale is arguably the greatest thing to come out of the franchise since The Empire Strikes Back. It just means that a few of the episodes that would have been produced between seasons 6 and 7 just never got made. And that is a legitimate problem with the show, despite it not being its own fault. Cad Bane and Ventress obviously completely disappear in a way that's not all that satisfying, and I've already talked about the lame fact that a massive chunk of Maul's story just got tossed over to a comic book. This is a pretty annoying flaw, but I don't think it takes too much away from the story as a whole. And additionally, it's pretty irritating that you have to watch the final 4 episodes of the show either before or after Revenge of the Sith, even though they both take place at the exact same time, cover or reference many of the same events, and end at pretty much the same spot. But we'll get to more of that later. Alright, so now we're entering really weird territory. We have officially reached the point where Lucas is no longer in control of the story he created, but instead Disney is. And I'm just going to say it straight up. I think everything after Clone Wars is completely invalid Star Wars material. It's fanfiction. And that doesn't mean that it's all bad or that it's all even good. It just means that since the creator of the story isn't attached to it, there's no way that it can actually be Star Wars. Lucas doesn't even need to direct or write. He just needs to be overseeing in some sort of capacity, like in Clone Wars, or have picked somebody he trusts to tell proper stories in his universe, who he still oversees in some capacity, like in Clone Wars. It doesn't matter what elements you borrow from the original source material or from the creator's vision, if you are telling a story in someone else's world with absolutely zero input from the creator, then you're just making fan fiction. Disney Star Wars is no more valid than any fan film you could find online. This is just true. So I am going to keep talking about all these movies and shows because it is all going to lead to the ultimate point I'm trying to make about the state of the current Star Wars story and how to fix it, but at this point, we're not even really talking about Star Wars anymore. So let's establish one more thing before I keep going. I haven't actually seen Rebels. I haven't seen it in entirety, I haven't seen even one episode. And unless something happens, I never will. But let's immediately get ahead of the whole, oh, you haven't seen it so you can't have an opinion on it crap. Because that is crap. You don't always have to see the thing you're talking about to have a valid opinion on it, depending on what your opinion is. And I established at the start of this video that I'm here to talk specifically about the Star Wars story. and with that in mind, I can talk about how the mere existence of an entry in that larger story can affect that larger story. If Vince Gilligan, for example, suddenly announced that he's making a show called Heisenberg's Time-Hopping Heisenbaths, and that it was going to be 10 seasons of Walter White taking a different bath in a different time period across all of human history, with each episode taking place between an episode of Breaking Bad, there'd be no reason for me to watch that before I'd be allowed to call its impact on the Breaking Bad story stupid. It's an outlandish example, but I think it proves my point. The very existence of something can be problematic enough that you can have an opinion on it without seeing it. So, my stance on Rebels is this. The gap of time between Revenge of the Sith and A New Hope should never be shown or depicted in any form whatsoever, and it especially should not be shown from the perspective of characters that are completely inconsequential to the larger Star Wars story. The Star Wars story is, as I think I've said already, about Anakin and Luke, and anything that does not enhance their story in some way is filler. And that pointless filler could be the best stuff you've ever seen, but it's still pointless filler. And the gap in time between the prequels and original trilogy is at its most powerful when we don't see what happened during it. A lot of Episode 3's power comes from the fact that this closes out the story for the next 20 years. And a lot of Episode 4's power comes from the fact that this is the first time we are revisiting this galaxy since everything went to shit. Everything during this time is intended to be miserable and sad and mellow, and that it is the absence of certain stories that make the other stories stronger. This is once again just true. It's the reason we all hate the midichlorians. It took away the magic of the Force that was much stronger when it was left up to our own imaginations. There's a magic in ambiguity, and Star Wars, specifically Disney Star Wars, has a habit for killing that magic wherever it can. With all that being said, Rebels is about a random group of rebels that don't matter at all in the larger narrative, and have no connection whatsoever to Anakin or to Luke. So, it's pointless. And I'll also add that despite not having watched the full show, I do actually know a lot of stuff that goes down in the show, and I know that in the grand Star Wars narrative, it is pointless. Because most of these characters have nothing to do with anything important to the core story, and so we just shouldn't be seeing them at all, because that is filler. This stuff is exclusively Star Wars filler. Especially because it's not even tied to any grander stories or events that do actually expand upon Anakin or Luke in a meaningful way, like Clone Wars did. Even certain Clone Wars arcs that didn't show Anakin at all end up being pretty essential because they are pivotal to understanding later events that do include him, or they deepen the context of the Jedi, the war, or whatever else in a way that shows us more about his personal journey. None of that happens here, or at least none of it happens significantly enough to warrant existing. Even with the characters that mattered before or that will matter later. Nothing with Vader adds to anything we see in the original trilogy, nor does anything with the brief Yoda and Sidious moments. And characters like Ahsoka, Maul, Rex, and Bo-Katan shouldn't have ever shown up again after the events of the Clone Wars finale. The power of that ending was in how heart-shatteringly final it was. It was a death of not just the clones and the war, but of many of the people it swept up. Ahsoka, Maul, Rex, and Bo-Katan, without having to physically die, are all casualties of Palpatine's plan and of the war. They all played their parts and were, quite appropriately, left behind in the wreckage of it all. Our final moments with them are excellent, and we never needed to see more of them, especially because they do not, and cannot, affect any of the events that Luke is a part of in the original trilogy. In the eyes of the Star Wars story, their arcs have concluded and they no longer matter. So as cool as this scene is, and as great as this scene is, none of it matters. None of it should have been made, and its existence cheapens the emotional weight of what came before and what comes after. And I also obviously don't like all the stuff about how goofy the stormtroopers are depicted, how childish the main cast is, and how annoying it is to have an Order 66 survivor. If you want this point elaborated, it's the same general idea as what I explained about midichlorians and the Force. The story required that Kenobi, Yoda, and Ahsoka survive the Purge, and nobody else matters. Regardless of whether you believe other Jedi survived or not, it doesn't matter. Actually seeing Jedi survivors in Star Wars movies or shows cheapens the emotional weight of what occurs in Revenge of the Sith and the Clone Wars. That's pretty much all I have to say about this show. It could actually be an awesome show. I don't know. I don't really think it is, but I'm not really gonna try and find out either. And now the first of the sequels. And what is there to say? If we're being fully honest, just as a movie, The Force Awakens is honestly pretty great. It's got great cinematography, special effects, acting, character work, and music. On a technical level, at least, this, and the rest of the sequels for that matter, are a complete knockout. They're incredibly well-made films. The issues with The Force Awakens, though, and the other two sequels, almost exclusively lie in the story. They didn't have a plan for this trilogy, and it shows. They are messy, they're disrespectful, tonally inconsistent, and constantly pivoting direction. There's just no central anything with these movies. Each one feels like it was trying to do a different thing entirely than the last one. Force Awakens is a copy and paste of A New Hope. The Last Jedi is obsessed with surprises and subverted expectations without any satisfying payoffs, and The Rise of Skywalker is a desperate attempt to please all the fans, but that ultimately can't please any. But it's weird because on their own, all of these movies are pretty fun watches, and as I said, they are all amazing on a technical level. The real problem lies in the story. That's really what it all boils down to. The simple reality is that the sequels are good movies, but they aren't good Star Wars movies. Since the intended Star Wars story is, and has always been, about Anakin Skywalker and Luke's role in redeeming him, there is pretty much no way at all that there could ever be a good story for a Star Wars sequel. I know there's a lot of cool stuff in the expanded universe, but if we're strictly talking about the core intended Skywalker story like I am, then there is absolutely nothing that can be done after the closing credits of Return of the Jedi. Because at the end of that movie, the galaxy is liberated, the Emperor is dead, Anakin is redeemed, and Luke and his friends have not just saved the day, but also found love, friendship, happiness, and closure. There are no loose ends. It's over. The story we have been following from the beginning of the Phantom Menace is done. Finished. It's completely concluded. There's absolutely nothing more to tell from this story. Everything from here on out is just cool little side stuff that doesn't matter. But since Anakin is gone, the core story is no more. I feel very strongly that Star Wars and many other franchises like Lord of the Rings or Avatar should never tell any stories taking place after their grand finale. What else is there to tell after this? What story is there after this? Yeah, there's always room for fun little side stories and spin-offs, but at the end of the day, the core story is over and has reached its best, most satisfying conclusion possible, and anything that comes after takes away from the power of that ending. When you bring back stormtroopers, you make all of this pointless. When you make Luke a bitter old man, you take away from all of this. When you introduce Snoke or bring back Sidious, you render Anakin and his sacrifice meaningless. These movies take away everything that made the original saga a story worth telling. The entire existence of the sequels and the story they tell renders the previous 6 movies absolutely and completely pointless. It is for all of these reasons that I believe the sequels are genuinely screwed from the start and could have essentially never been done well. I don't think there could have been a good Episode 7, from a story standpoint. Lucas even said this back in the day before he sold the franchise.
There's possibility there may be another offshoot movie somewhere, but not about Luke Skywalker, not about that group of people. All right, there is no Episode 7.
So there really isn't much more to say. I see no point in talking about any of the actual content of these movies because it just doesn't matter. As I said before, it's not Star Wars. It can't be. These movies are fan fiction. They just are. So I guess that's that. Now this is a very easy movie to talk about. Rogue One is great. I like it a lot. Great visuals, story, music, everything. It's got some flaws in the way of cameos and characters and some other stuff, but as a whole, it's very good. From the perspective of the core Star Wars story, though, this movie shouldn't exist. None of the spin-offs should. Rogue One is a filler speed bump in an otherwise excellently paced saga. Going from the Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones, then to Clone Wars, to Revenge of the Sith, to the original trilogy, is awesome. It's, in essence, and intent at least, the best way to experience the saga. Adding in Rogue One just grinds the main story to a halt, focuses on random unimportant characters, and is about an event that never needed to be depicted. Plus, circling back to something I said a while ago, the scale of each entry in a story really does matter. Rogue One is the first time in this series that the scale is thrown off. All the main Skywalker saga films are, deservedly, big 2-hour-long epics. And all the supplemental content like Clone Wars and even Rebels is appropriately packaged into a TV show consisting of many small chapters. The The stuff that's essential is a big grand movie, and the stuff that's supplemental is presented smaller. Rogue One throws all of that out of whack by being presented as just as big and grand as the Skywalker saga films. Think once again of Star Wars as one large story with a long list of chapters. It does not make sense for the Rogue One chapter to be just as big and grand as the Anakin and Luke chapters. I guess then my whole stance on this movie just boils down to that it's cool, I'm glad it exists for the people who like it, and who want different things out of the franchise than me, but if you're just trying to experience the core Star Wars story in the best way possible, Rogue One is better left out. Plus, it takes place in between episodes 3 and 4, which, as I explained before, is not good for the story at all. I'll say it once again, sometimes certain things are better left undepicted. To interject in my own video for a moment, a few weeks after recording everything that you just listened to, I thought of another point, and I just kind of wanted to throw it in here really quickly, and honestly really sloppily. I recently just watched Conclave the other day, and there's a scene where a bomb goes off, which up until that point, everything in the movie was strictly dialogue-driven, and it made me think about the importance of appropriately weighted big moments in stories. That bomb scene was pretty shocking, and it felt like a pretty big deal, because it was, and a lot of that had to do with the fact that the rest of the movie was mostly just talking. And because I'm me, this later made me think about Rogue One and its impact on the rest of the Star Wars narrative. So recognizing that the scale of one thing affects the impact of another thing, and considering Star Wars under this lens, I feel like it's pretty clear that the scale of this stuff is negatively affecting the impact of this stuff. When the content of Rogue One is depicted as so epic and massive and explosive, it sets a standard for the franchise and takes away from the other things we see in the story. It's the reason this stuff in Avatar is so effective, because we hadn't been shown anything so powerful before. And it's the same reason this finale doesn't feel as epic as it could have been, because the other stuff in this show has been treated as so crazy and insane the whole way through. Anyway, that's just another stray thought that I had. I think it's clear Rogue One's scale takes away a lot from the stuff that we see later, and it makes it feel lesser by comparison. Everything I said about The Force Awakens applies here as well. This movie is fan fiction and, in essence, fundamentally wrecks the Skywalker saga. Again, as a movie though, it's great, it's a very well-made film and very fun to watch as its own thing. Basically, a great movie, but a bad Star Wars movie. This movie is pretty good. It's fun, I guess. Take everything I said about Rogue One and just slap it onto Solo. Genuinely asking, what is this show? Has anyone actually seen it? I've seen one trailer and I know what it's supposed to be about, I guess, but I'm not gonna watch it to find out any more, so if anyone has actually seen it, please, let me know. I'm genuinely curious. I'd like to know why you did or didn't like it. Seriously. So this one is really interesting. This is another show that I've never actually seen, despite being aware of pretty much everything that happens in it and the fact that I've seen countless scenes. It's a show that seems genuinely fantastic and is also one of the only exceptions to my entire opinion about spin-off stories. I think that if Star Wars absolutely had to continue making shows taking place after the conclusion of Return of the Jedi, Mandalorian Season 1 would be the way to do it. Because, despite everything I'm saying, I do love this world and would love to keep seeing more content if it's done in a specific way. Continuing to tell Star Wars stories that take place in a post-Sidious galaxy is an awesome idea, if and only if it remains completely and entirely disconnected from everything else in the franchise. No characters we've seen before, no interconnected plots, no attachment to anything in the mainline Star Wars story. That'd be an amazing way to keep revisiting this awesome universe without tampering with the core story. And that's obviously what Mandalorian Season 1 did, and is part of why it's so loved. I'm pretty sure, aside from this little Darksaber tease, the first season of the show stood completely separate from anything in any of the prior films or shows. And that's cool. When it first came out back in 2019, I really wanted to watch it. All my friends were saying it was awesome and that I'd love it, and I was sure I probably would love it. But I was extremely hesitant that it would continue to stand apart from the rest of the franchise. I was pretty certain that it would switch up in later seasons and start connecting itself too strongly to the larger Star Wars saga. And lo and behold, Season 2 threw in Boba Fett and Ahsoka and Bo-Katan and Luke Skywalker. Now it's all connecting and leading into tons more spin-off shows, and as I said before, the Star Wars story should not continue on after Return of the Jedi. It's borderline impossible to keep going without messing up everything that came before. And so now, in 2025, we see that Star Wars is trying to keep going with this large interconnected universe of stories. But it's got the same problem that the Marvel universe has been having for the past few years. It's not building to anything. There's no forward momentum. There's no narrative thrust because there's no endgame. There's nothing to build to. The whole story already started and already ended, and unless you reintroduce another big bad like Snoke or bring back the last big bad, which they did and it sucked, then there's nothing and nowhere to go to. What's the point of connecting it all and teasing upcoming adventures if none of it has anything to build up to? Isn't that why we're all so frustrated with Marvel right now? Because regardless of how good or bad an individual movie is, they are all still trying to reference each other and tease the next project, but it never actually feels like it's going anywhere, like it's building to anything. Seriously, what is Star Wars' endgame right now? Where is it going? I know they're building the Thrawn stuff up right now and have a big crossover movie planned, but to what end? What happens after? Because that's certainly not going to be a better and more satisfying end than Return of the Jedi. Does Star Wars just become an amazing and emotionally satisfying story about the Chosen One and the restoration of balance in the Force, then just pivot off into a couple heroes teaming up to defeat a blue guy? And then that's the end? Because if it is the end, it's not going to leave anyone more satisfied than the ending we already had in Return of the Jedi. And if it's not the end, then literally what is the actual point? What is the end? Why are we still going? What are we building to? That's my whole point. There's nowhere left to go. Star Wars just keeps going and going and going, but it's not going anywhere at all. And even if it comes up with a place it wants to go to, it won't be a better place than the place it already left. So I really genuinely think Mandalorian should have just stayed the way it was in Season 1. Disconnected from the Skywalker saga, its own thing. And then they could just go make a bunch of other stuff in the same way they made The Mandalorian. All of them separate. All of them disconnected. Then you've got endless Star Wars content to enjoy, but you still preserve the core story. Everybody wins this way. But whatever, that didn't happen. Whatever. This is obviously a video game, and it doesn't really fit much into all of what I'm talking about, but because it's considered canon, I think it raises an important little subpoint that I'd like to make. As I talked about before, having a consistent medium with which you're telling a story does matter. Star Wars is primarily told through film or a TV series, which functions in most of the same ways, and so regardless of what any video game, comic, book, or whatever else might have to add to the story, I think its medium renders it pretty irrelevant. Because if we're trying to talk about how to experience the core Star Wars story in the best way possible, it does not make sense to hop from a movie to a book to a video game or anything like that. So yes, for the argument I'm making here, I am going to write all of this type of content off based on medium alone. If you think this stuff is cool, awesome. If you don't think this stuff is cool, that's fine. All I'm saying is that when trying to experience the core Star Wars story, this stuff doesn't have a place. Ooh, this movie. This movie is so lame. I hate this movie so much. It's the only one I've only seen one time, and it's all the same things that are wrong with The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi. It's a fine movie, but a terrible Star Wars movie, and perfectly encapsulates what I was saying about the story having nowhere to go. Because really, what is this ending? Does anyone really finish Return of the Jedi and go, that was cool, but I can't wait to get to the real ending of the saga? This movie just annihilates everything that made the original 6 movies matter. If you treat the sequel trilogy as canon, then you basically don't need to watch the previous 6. Sidious comes back and gets beaten. That's it. It's all there in this trilogy. So why watch any of this? Oh my god, it's so awful. So I haven't seen a single episode from any of these shows, but they all have the exact same problems as everything else. Cheapening the deaths of prior characters, revisiting characters that were already given perfect send-offs, telling stories during time periods where stories should not have been told, showing us stuff we don't need to see at all, adding to the Star Wars lore in weird and stupid ways. And each of these shows could be a perfect masterpiece in its own right, and I would still feel this way. Some of them probably are, but it doesn't matter. They are, in essence, all harmful to the core Star Wars story. That's just true. Before I get to making my final points, I just want to take a second to mention Star Wars Visions. This show is awesome. I love it. Please make shows like this about every single franchise. None of it is canon, but all of it is unique and interesting. Regardless of whether any given episode of this show is good or bad is totally irrelevant. They are all an example of true and genuine creativity, completely standalone, and offer unique reimagining of the franchise we all love. Yeah, there's some good, yeah, there's some bad, it's not all awesome, but it all tries so hard and is all so unique. Now that I've talked about just about every aspect of the Star Wars story I could think of and that I thought was relevant, it's time for me to go through the how you can fix it part of this video. So let's start by identifying all of the major issues that need fixing, most of which we can and a few of which we can't. Firstly, the ranging quality across the entire narrative. Second, the scaling issues across the entire narrative. Third, the inconsistent lore and canon. The quality, specifically of the Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones. I'll get to this one a little bit later, just bear with me. The pacing issues created by the Clone Wars and the Revenge of the Sith overlap, the second Death Star, the Ewoks, and Return of the Jedi's pacing. The vast majority of the issues created by the first 3 items in this list can be eliminated simply by excluding most movies and shows in this franchise, which can definitely suck, but it's undeniable that sometimes omitting certain things you might really love from a story can massively improve the rest of the story. There's a reason the phrase "kill your darlings" is so often used. Nothing that has been made after Disney purchased the franchise has had a positive enough impact on the core story to warrant its existence. Yes, individual things they have made might be cool, and tons of people might personally like that stuff, and they might expand the world or lore a little bit, but it is just blatantly true that none of them have actually done enough to enhance the true core story of Star Wars. Instead, they've actually taken away from it. Let's go through these really quickly to illustrate how removing a lot of stuff actually can strengthen the stuff you keep around. Removing the existence of The Force Awakens, The Last Jedi, and The Rise of Skywalker is obvious. Not only does it remove 3 awful stories from the larger Star Wars narrative, but it further solidifies Return of the Jedi as the actual final conclusive ending. And if you take this even further, removing the existence of Skeleton Crew, Ahsoka, Boba Fett, Resistance, and Mandalorian, you've officially eliminated everything that takes place after the galaxy is liberated from Sidious, as well as getting rid of even more bad stories in this universe. And then going all the way to the other side of this, if you eliminate the Acolyte and the Dooku episodes of Tales of the Jedi, then your official starting point for the Star Wars narrative is the opening of the Phantom Menace, and nothing before it. This starts the story exactly where it should begin, with the story that introduces Anakin, who, as our main character, should be introduced at the start. From the perspective of the core story, Star Wars should not begin with Dooku or with any of these people. And to finalize all of this elimination, it's also best to remove the existence of the remaining Tales of the Jedi episodes, as well as Tales of the Empire, The Bad Batch, Solo, Kenobi, Andor, Rebels, and Rogue One. This clears out all the fat and all the filler that takes place in between the actual meat of the Star Wars narrative. There are so many benefits to this that I personally think far outweigh the negatives. For a few examples, this scene is so much more powerful when it stands as our official introduction to this universe, our first step into the Star Wars story. This scene is infinitely more emotional when it stands as the final time these two characters ever see each other. All of these scenes are so much more powerful when they are the last time we, as an audience, ever get to see these characters. And these closing credits hit so much harder when you know the story is about to skip over about 20 years of time. Additionally, seeing these characters again hits so appropriately hard when this was the last time we saw them, and all of these final moments are so immensely emotionally fulfilling when you know it's the actual end, when you know there's nothing else after. It's what an ending should feel like. That feeling of closure and the hurt that comes with it, the hurt that you don't necessarily want to feel, but that is what gives that closure all of its power. It's what makes it special. I also, as mentioned earlier, think it's best to remove a lot of the arcs in the 3D Clone Wars series, both for the sake of quality and eliminating filler, but I'm going to show and talk about my list for that a little bit later. Additionally, you might have noticed that I didn't list the 2D Clone Wars series in all of this, and that's because my reasons for omitting that one are a bit more complicated than everything else. It's tough because it is a genuinely good show and does feature some events and character moments that you could say are important in the way that the 3D Clone Wars stuff is, but I still think it's best to exclude this series when watching the saga as a complete whole, and that's because of its presentation, its pacing, and its tone. The presentation, pacing, and tone of the original 6 films are obviously fairly consistent, or at least it is across each trilogy, and the 3D Clone Wars series goes to great lengths to fall in line with them in almost all aspects. And even though it is also animation, its more realistic style still allows it to fit right in. Regardless of its actual quality, the 2D Clone Wars series doesn't really fit right in. It is not only that it is the only 2D animated story in the saga, but it is much more wild and crazy than everything else, and when trying to experience the core narrative as best as possible, it does stand out in a bit of a bad way. It also creates a weird viewing order, slotting in after Attack of the Clones, but between the 3D Clone Wars, and some might say this is nitpicking and hating on something creative and different for no reason at all, but as I've been saying the whole time, I'm arguing for the core intended Star Wars narrative, and that's going to include cutting a lot of stuff for the sake of quality, consistency, presentation, and pacing. So in the process of eliminating all of these shows and movies, we have actually already done most of the heavy lifting and have massively strengthened the actual core of the Star Wars story. None of the other issues in the franchise are nearly as large as all of what was just solved. So all that's left is to fix the issues that remain in the core 6 films and in the Clone Wars series. And this is where I believe the power of editing comes in. And while I know fan editing usually has a very bad reputation, typically rightfully so, it's undeniable that good fan edits can exist, if they stay aligned with the spirit of the original story and don't go too far. And as someone who deeply loves the core Star Wars story, I think I can pretty safely suggest the right places to edit, enhance, or tweak the original story's flaws and inconsistencies in order to bring out the best version of it. Let's start with the issue created by the overlap of Revenge of the Sith and the Clone Wars finale. If you start with the Phantom Menace, then go to Attack of the Clones, and then the Clone Wars series, you bump into an annoying complication. Do you watch the final 4 episodes of the Clone Wars before Revenge of the Sith, or after? Because those episodes start right before Revenge of the Sith starts, but then they both take place at blatantly the same time and end at around the same spot. And even if you have a preference on which one to watch first, it doesn't change the fact that it's weird to finish this part of the Star Wars story just to hop backwards and do it all again from the point of view of other characters. It's a very weird way to close out this massive chapter of the story. What I'm pitching here is a combined cut of Revenge of the Sith and the final 4 episodes of the Clone Wars. And yeah, I'm not at all the first person to suggest this, and I'm definitely not the first person to ever make one, but I do think that I have made one of, if not the best edits for this. I've seen a few of these, and while many are pretty good, they all tend to mess up in a few key areas. Mainly, there's a few that just blatantly intercut entire 20-some minute chunks of Clone Wars into different spots in Revenge of the Sith, which really is not the way to do it. Arguably, the biggest problems when creating a cut like this is messing up the pacing and tonal consistency, and that's something I really wanted to avoid. So before I started editing, I made a list of every scene in both of these stories, and then I went through one by one and I found the places they fit into the chronological timeline as well as taking into account their tone and what they depict. For example, Anakin and Obi-Wan get trapped on their mission to rescue the Chancellor, as does Ahsoka on her mission to capture Maul. So when splicing these two stories together, I thought it was fitting that they are shown one after the other in the final edit, to keep the tone and the pacing flowing properly. In fact, Anakin and Obi-Wan's mission and Ahsoka's mission have many parallel moments that I used to line them up, a tactic I used when editing the entire film together. And for another example, there were sometimes context clues given in certain scenes that indicate where they should be placed, such as the music in these two scenes, as well as the topic of conversation they both contain. To top all of this off, I also went the extra mile to fix a few minor problems in the Revenge of the Sith side of things, such as Vader's scream, and some brief pacing issues in some moments like the elevator scene. But before I walk through all the details of that edit, I want to talk about the edits I think should be made to Return of the Jedi, which is the final piece of all of this. A New Hope is obviously fixed by just not watching the special edition, and Empire is fine as is, so it really just leaves Return of the Jedi. As I identified before, the key issues with this film are the pacing, the second Death Star, and the Ewoks. Unfortunately, I don't actually think there's anything that can be done about the second Death Star. That's something that just sucks about all of this, is that some things are just too ingrained in the story to be salvageable. But thankfully, as I said before, the second Death Star is annoying, but it's not story-ruining, so it's just okay as is. The pacing and the Ewoks, however, can be dealt with. The pacing side of things is a little bit more tricky to solve, and if I'm being honest, I'm still kind of in the weeds with it myself, so I'm going to save that end of things for a little bit later, and I'm going to talk about the Ewoks for now. They are actually extremely easy to fix, and I think I've pretty much done so. Seeing as it's not their actual presence in the story that makes them so annoying, but rather their role in the third act, helping defeat the stormtroopers and everything, we don't need to cut them entirely, but rather just cut the scenes of them beating stormtroopers. So they still show up as usual, and they still assist the rebels in finding the Imperial base, but instead of showing them fighting the Imperials, I left in only the scene of them popping out and providing a temporary distraction for the rebels, and then also left in only the scenes of them running away and getting shot at. I kept no scenes of them actually fighting. So this scene now plays out so that the rebels get captured, the Ewoks show up and cause a distraction, and then the rebels save the day all on their own. And for good measure, I restored this old deleted scene of the rebels inside the Imperial base to give Han more of a role in the final act. So yeah, that's pretty much that. Those are my broader ideas for how to fix the Star Wars story. And now if you're interested in seeing the actual practical application of all of this, I'm going to be switching over to an unscripted walkthrough type format now. I'm going to explain how to do a lot of these edits yourself, and then also share some stray extra thoughts that I've left unaddressed throughout the video that I didn't really feel like I could tackle properly in the essay format, like how to handle the quality of episodes 1 and 2. So if you're interested in that, that's what I'm going to be covering next. And if you're not interested in that, then here is my concluding statements now. Basically, a lot of franchises today, especially Star Wars, have grown far too big for their own good. They have expanded so much that they've not only lost sight of the original story that drew us all in the first place, but have begun actively damaging that original story. In almost every case, though, I think there is a solution, and it just involves a lot of letting go and a little bit of editing magic. It can obviously be pretty difficult to disregard content from your favorite franchises, but sometimes the act of doing so can greatly strengthen the core foundation of that franchise and that story. And that's the simple truth with Star Wars. Everything from Rebels on simply dilutes the core story, and it's better to just pretend it doesn't exist. Yeah, it sucks to lose a few cool movies and shows along the way, but speaking from experience, it makes the actual Star Wars story a million times better. I'm at the point where I just genuinely fully treat everything from Rebels on as non-existent fanfiction. To me, none of the events of Kenobi or The Bad Batch or Rogue One or whatever else even happened. In my mind, they quite literally do not exist, and therefore have no impact on the story I actually love. And when I watch Star Wars from start to finish, without all the extra crap, it's incredible, legitimately amazing. You can think I'm wrong right now, that's totally fine, but I seriously suggest that anyone that has an issue with the current state of this franchise gives this way of watching Star Wars a go. Sit down at the start of the saga, follow it through to the end with only Clone Wars added in, experience the combined Revenge of the Sith and Clone Wars finale mega supercut movie, even if it's not my version specifically, and just push everything else from the franchise out of your head. Just pretend it doesn't exist. Then go do the original trilogy, get to the end of Return of the Jedi, and just stop. Completely. Treat it like it's the actual end, like there's nothing else at all. If you do that, and you don't feel incredibly emotionally fulfilled, and like you just watched one of the best, most complete stories ever, then, I don't know, I guess I don't know what to say. But I'm betting that most people who do this will feel the same way as me. Because this right here is what the entire Star Wars story would now be. 2 films that, while lackluster, open the saga appropriately, that then lead into a brilliant series filled with energy, heart, depth, action, and emotion, all building towards a thunderous climactic tragedy that, after a significant gap in the story's timeline, then feeds perfectly into the original 3 films, which exist as a slower, more appropriately mellow finale in a post-Jedi and post-Republic era. It's just beautiful. And that's the Star Wars story. That's what it is at its core. It's just incredible and is without a doubt one of the best stories ever told. All it needs is a little bit of tweaking and a little bit of cleaning up. And coming from someone who truly deeply loves this story and wants it to be as great as it can be, I think this is it. I think this is the best, or as close to the best as one can get, way to experience the Star Wars story. Okay, so I am now in the unscripted, screen-recorded part of this video, and I wanted to start by going over my combined edit of Revenge of the Sith and the final 4 episodes of The Clone Wars. So I edited this in Premiere, Adobe Premiere Pro, and if you know anything about editing, then this should all be fairly familiar to you. If you don't know anything about editing, don't worry about it. Just pay attention to this part of the screen here, because this is where the movie is going to be, and I'll try and make that a little bigger. So for those of you that do know a little bit more about editing, I'm just going to note real quickly that I since I've been working on this for so long, I originally started this back in like 2022, I think. I lost all of my original files that I used to throw this together, and so I'm now working with the exported version. So if there's a few parts of this that you're like, wait, how did he throw that audio on there or that clip on there or whatever? This is the exported movie re-cut through. So it kind of just doesn't have all of the extra things I added on the timeline because a lot of it is already built into these clips. So it's an annoying little weird thing that still bugs me. I don't know what I did wrong to lose all of these files, but somewhere along the line, I did lose all those files. So I'm just going to go through this fairly quickly. I don't feel like there's a need to dwell on too much of this. I just want to kind of jump through where I cut different parts to show how I pace this out, and then I'm going to linger a little bit on certain parts that maybe I think deserve a little more attention because of a certain adjustment I made, a certain sound I added, or anything of that sort. And I will get into all of that now, I guess. So to start off, I did a little opener for this because one of the strongest things I feel about the last 4 episodes of the Clone Wars is that they all have really, really strong opening, like, title segments. Obviously, Clone Wars usually has, like, the fanfare, and there's just something so... It hits in a really specific way when you're watching those last 4 episodes to have each title have a different sound and a different, like, piece of music, and it just really sets the tone well. And I thought that it would be appropriate to have something that really, really sets the tone well for the first... just the opening of this entire movie, that you've just gone through all of Clone Wars, and you're about to watch the 4-hour supercut that is just, obviously, this is a complete tragedy of a film, and I just thought that it deserved a appropriate opener. So I will just show this. I created this using the piece of music from Attack of the Clones where Anakin goes into the Tusken Raider camp, and I found a few sound bites from different movies and different episodes that I thought were thematically fitting to kind of create this opener where you hear some voice clips from different parts of the saga set to this kind of eerie, foreboding music. So I will just let this play real quick. Okay, so that's that. And the other thing that I wanted to highlight is in the opening that obviously Clone Wars' first 4 episodes, or at least the first episode of those 4, has its own, like, little, not title crawl, but they always have those, the admiral that does the opening narration. And I was trying to figure out how do I fit that in while still having the title crawl, and I actually wasn't able to come up with my own idea. I found one from another fan edit that I thought was very, very fitting. I obviously am not the, like, mastermind behind Star Wars fan edits. I'm not the best in the world at this stuff. And so I took an idea out of somebody else's edit. So Madman's Knowledge was a editor who did this kind of same thing. He made a 4-hour cut, and I didn't necessarily love everything that he did in his cut, but I thought that he found a really, really clever solution to this in that he played the opening title crawl, but he wrote out the narration that the Admiral reads. So you'll see here, I just basically took this right out of his thing, and, you know, it is fantastic what he did here. So you see the opening title comes up, and then that text is obviously not the text that's in Revenge of the Sith, it's the text that's in the, not the text, but the narration that's at the start of the Clone Wars, with the Clone Wars intro B-roll playing in the background. And I just thought this was really a stellar way to do this. So I'll let this play for a second too. Yeah, and then he did this really cool thing where he just kind of had it fade directly into the action, and the music and the effects come back in, and it sounds incredible. I think this is probably the best way to do this. So, yeah. After that, there is just a long chunk of Clone Wars here. I'll also note that I color-coded all of this, so yellow is Clone Wars and red is Revenge of the Sith. So there's this entire animated chunk. There's obviously no other way to rearrange this because this stuff chronologically is just, this all takes place at the beginning. And then I have it cut right here into Revenge of the Sith for the first time. And I'm going to full screen this while I let this play. I absolutely love how this part turned out. I really love this transition. And then this is where I have found that I typically differ from the other people who make these edits, is that I know a lot of people will just let the entirety of this like opening act of Revenge of the Sith kind of play out, or at least most of it, and then they'll play the first episode of the Clone Wars. And this is what I was talking about earlier, where I think it works way better for pacing and tonal consistency and everything to have these splice between the two. So, I mean, as in any real movie, it's got to kind of jump between the two bits of action that are happening at the same time. And here, I'll just kind of, there's no really better way to show this than to just let it play out on screen. So here is where I cut back to the Clone Wars after Anakin and Obi-Wan have landed.
R2, go back. I need you to stay with the ship.
Yeah, take this. Wait for orders.
And so now in the timeline, we have Anakin and Obi-Wan who have just flown in with this big space shot to rescue the Chancellor, and then we cut to Ahsoka and her big space shot as she goes to capture Darth Maul. And I think that it is just tonally very consistent, and pacing-wise, we are just right side by side with these two stories. And then it plays out to this point, and I will show where I cut it again. So from here, I think it's best to just skip ahead again. I don't think I need to comment on every single piece of this as I go. So I cut here again.
His fate will be the same as ours.
I'm skipping ahead a little bit more. So this is kind of, as I was showing, this is keeping things like linked up in the type of events that are happening. So obviously, Ahsoka here is just about to walk into a trap, and I have this segment of Revenge of the Sith where Anakin and Obi-Wan fall into a trap. And so right after they fall into a trap, I then cut to the bit where Ahsoka falls into a trap. I think I mentioned this earlier in my script, but I think showing it side by side here is fitting of how I keep the events and the tone consistent throughout, so that at no point an audience member would feel jarred by any of this. So let's show this transition.
Do you have a plan B?
The Jedi was sighted entering the...
So then I cut ahead to this bit here, right as Ahsoka encounters Maul. I thought it would be very fitting to have Obi-Wan and Anakin encounter Grievous.
Why are you here?
So once again, parallel stories going on here. And then I also want to note that even though most Star Wars movies, I mean all Star Wars movies, use, I want to say almost 100% of the time, every transition is a wipe. I tried to use as many wipes as possible, but I don't think that they always fit. So, like here, obviously, a wipe is very easy to throw in because of this little gap where the characters aren't actually saying anything. But here, sometimes it's more powerful to just do a hard cut. So I tried to do as many wipes as I could to stay true to the spirit of Star Wars and the way that they're edited, but sometimes I did need to kind of bend that a little to have just a direct, hard cut that I think works a little better than if it had been a wipe. So here, I'll just play that again just so you can see that. I think that works pretty well, at least. So the next time I cut is right here. And then another cut here. Just jump ahead.
We've lost them.
All the escape pods have been launched.
Yeah, and that's another hard cut. So this here in Clone Wars, if you remember, was officially where this little storyline in the pipelines of Mandalore concluded. Ahsoka lost Maul, and I don't think that we, if I'm remembering correctly, let me check, we don't revisit her again until this scene where they're all meeting. So, since that was the official ending point of Ahsoka's little chase story, captured story, all that kind of stuff, I thought that I should let the Revenge of the Sith side of things also conclude. Just to kind of, again, keep these parallel stories hitting around the same beats and keeping the same flow. So it cuts back to Anakin and Obi-Wan, and this entire storyline plays out here. The ship lands, crashes, and then for chronological order, it has to stay on Revenge of the Sith for quite a big gap of time here. So there's all of this. And then, as I talked about before, how I think the intro music and intro text and just kind of the atmosphere that the Clone Wars finale, final 4 episodes openers would have, I wanted to preserve that. The first time I went around making this edit, it was just kind of like a straight shot. I didn't split it up into like a part 1, part 2, or anything like that. But I have recently decided that it was a big loss to not have that opening music and that opening slow burn crawl. I guess that's not the best way to say it, but you know what I'm talking about. Those opening Clone Wars titles that would have that music sting that would make you kind of apprehensive to what comes next and get you in the feel of it all. So I have this split into parts. So it kind of, here, I'll just let this play out. This is where the end of part 1 officially happens, and it kind of goes to black, and then I let it come back in with the Clone Wars opener.
That's wonderful.
What are we gonna do?
We're not gonna worry about anything right now. All right? This is a happy moment. The happiest moment of my life.
So what I did there to make that flow pretty consistently is I put in this drum noise, this like really heavy echoing drum noise that you probably heard right here, where as soon as it cuts, that way it just kind of has that like appropriately weighty thematic like oomph moment. And then I kind of re-added the opening crawl in to fit the length of time that I needed to have it on screen. So from here, there's just a lot of Revenge of the Sith. Chronologically, you can't really put anything before this, so this is all just Revenge of the Sith stuff. Wow, there's a lot more than I thought. It cuts back to Clone Wars at the first chance that I was able to get, because this scene here, they mention that Anakin is on a special assignment to go spy on Palpatine, and you literally could not put the scene any earlier because he gets this assignment, obviously, in this whole section here. So I will let this transition here play out. The next cut is, there's another Clone Wars chunk. This is kind of the most, obviously, like, second act material here, where a lot of it is just set up for much of what is to come. Obviously, the first whole part of this is just action, action, action. And then this part is a lot of, like, these long stretches of just set up and talking and things like that that really set the stage for everything else. So kind of let a lot of this breathe. It would have been nice if I could have intercut more Clone Wars and Revenge of the Sith, but again, there is kind of like that chronological timeline barrier where you can't really move too much of this around. So a lot of Clone Wars plays out here, and then this is something that I am so impressed at how this has come together, and on the part of the people that made Clone Wars, they really knocked it out of the park with how well these things can get fit together. And I said in my last video that it's shocking that there's not an official edit for this published by Disney or anything like that, because it really feels like these just should have been connected. Like, Clone Wars and Revenge of the Sith just flow so perfectly into each other, and it feels like there were parts where Dave Filoni and his crew were basically just saying, hey, cut to Revenge of the Sith right here. So I mentioned earlier the throne room scene with Maul. As soon as he gets introduced here, there's this like heavy, deep opera type music, which fits very well with the music and the theme of what is playing here. And obviously the conversation between Anakin and Palpatine in this moment is about, it's very much alluding to him turning to the dark side and eventually becoming the apprentice and all of that, right around the same time that Maul is giving this information to Ahsoka and she doesn't believe it. And so I feel like putting these two right next to each other is just the best way to do this. It is so thematically deep, and it is just so, like, it just builds this level of, like, irony for the audience that I love. So I'll let these few transitions play out here.
Don't stay on my account. We'll be fine.
Go.
Okay, so that's where it cuts to Revenge of the Sith the first time. And then there is no better place to cut back, I think, than right here.
They only care about others.
Look at them.
And then all the way over here, this is the part that I'm saying basically just, it feels like it's just asking to be cut to Revenge of the Sith. Here, this part.
Every choice you have made has led you to this moment.
You ever hear the
I just absolutely love this bit here. And then cutting back here, this is the official end of this conversation between Anakin and Palpatine, and I cut back to kind of give it a little bit more weight to it. I cut back to mid-action scene between the clones and the Mandalorians, and then it goes right back into the scene with Ahsoka and Maul.
not from a Jedi.
This just feels like it really illustrates, to me at least, the conflict happening at the same time as him saying this, that it's like we're seeing this calm conversation between Anakin and Palpatine, but then we just hard cut to the actual war that is happening here. This all of his puppets fighting at the same time, and then we see Ahsoka making her decision, and in the end, making the wrong decision. And I love it so much. Skipping ahead, there is, just kind of have to let this entire Clone Wars bit play out, the entire fight, all the way up here, and Maul's capture, and then I let this end right where the actual Clone Wars episode ended, because I feel like this is a perfect little stopping point, perfect little cliffhanger before part 3. And I did the same thing I did last time here with the drum noise, that heavy drum that echoes in, and then reinserting the text at this part. So here's this. As I was looking at this part, I actually just completely forgot that I did not mention earlier in the film. I forgot because I cut it out and I haven't watched this clip in a long, long time. There's a part, obviously, where Anakin and Obi-Wan end up on an elevator, and it's just kind of like a little shenanigans moment. There's barely anything of actual substance that happens here. It just kind of wastes time, as well as some of the stuff with R2 and some of the battle droids that he encounters. So I cut that out because it really just kind of drags the pacing down and it feels like filler. So where did I cut that bit specifically? Let me see. Yeah, right here. Like before this part with Anakin and Obi-Wan, and around this part, between here would have been where that elevator was. But I just cut, or no, not between here. I think it would have been, you see them running on this scanner here, Grievous makes a comment about it, and then the elevator scene I think would have taken place right after this bit. Again, I haven't seen that part in a long time, so I might be wrong. But I just cut right here to the part where they exit the elevator, because everything that's happening here feels so tense and so important, and it just felt so weird to have a part of this movie where they just dick around on an elevator, basically. So I got rid of that part. So anyway, back to, we were around the end of part 2. This section here, it comes right back in with a bigger chunk of Revenge of the Sith again. There's a little bit of a slow part here where it's more set up for things to come. And yeah, this is a pretty big chunk of Revenge of the Sith here. Okay, so whenever Obi-Wan goes to fight Grievous is where I feel, when the action kicks back in, I feel like it's best to cut to Clone Wars again. Because this fight with Obi-Wan is obviously directly before everything goes down with Order 66. And so right at the peak of all this action, I felt it was best to cut back to kind of the somber aftermath of Mandalore to put these two in direct contrast to each other. That all of this is going on. Here, let me just, I'll just let this transition play. That all of this is going on, and then it comes back to show what Ahsoka is doing and the aftermath of this war. So we have an actual war contrasted with the aftermath of one. And then this little segment is another thing that, to give a lot of credit to Madman's Knowledge, the other guy that I mentioned who did an edit like this, he did this really, really cool thing where, and I'm just going to let this play while I talk. These two scenes from Revenge of the Sith and Attack of the Clones take place at exactly the same time, and they cover some of the literal same moments. And so you'll see this is a live action right now. And there's this conversation happening with all the Jedi in live action, but then in Clone Wars it's also happening in animation. So he did this thing where he actually kept the timeline fully intact, and he cut between the two, and it is just, it's so cool. I love what he did here. So I took this again, I took his idea, and I went with it in my own edit. So all the credit to him on this one. See here how it's 3D animation right now, and then I think right here it'll jump to live action. Yep, and that is just so cool the way that he did that. So I kind of recreated that. Let this part play out, and then I jump to this bit here with Palpatine. And so at this point, with what I was talking about with pacing and tone, this is kind of just letting all of the most important parts of this story build up. The Jedi are obviously talking about their concerns with Palpatine. Ahsoka is about to bring Maul back, and the music in her section is obviously building and getting more kind of somber and ominous. And then Anakin is meeting with Palpatine and finding out this horrible truth. All the while, Obi-Wan is engaged with Grievous, which is very clearly an important part of the story that could, bring the war to an end. So we have all four of these really, really important things playing out at the same time, and they are all not technically climactic yet, but they are all building to that point where they are going to pay off. And so it's just a lot of elements that feel like they're just building and building and building before it all lets loose at the right moment. So I have this bit with Revenge of the Sith play out, and I let the Obi-Wan and Grievous fight come to an end. This whole piece here and then I cut back to Clone Wars right after Mace Windu departs. So this is another moment that I am really, really proud of, in the way that I spliced it together. And I guess I should say I'm not, like, overly, like, pretentiously proud of it, because, again, this is Dave Filoni and his team basically telling you, this takes place at the exact same time as this other event, and it's basically just holding your hand to edit them together at this point. So I guess I shouldn't say proud of it, but more I am just amazed at how it turned out, and I love the way that these two connect with the music and the scenes and everything. So right at this point is when this, like, very similar theme to Padme's ruminations from Revenge of the Sith is playing, and they're transporting Maul, and it's just kind of this calm before the storm moment where everything is so quiet, there's barely any dialogue, it is just this feeling of something is so wrong. It should feel in this moment that there's, like, a victory happening, but it just feels like something really, really bad is on the horizon, and obviously we've seen the movie, and whenever you know everything that's coming, or even if you just seen the previous scenes, it's like, you know something is going to happen, and it has this tension that is so amazing. And the music that plays here is, as I said, Padme's ruminations from Revenge of the Sith, so I thought it would be appropriate to, let's see, splice it together right here and have these two moments hand off to each other. And I did a little bit of kind of fading in and out with the audio to make sure that the music stayed consistent through this so that it didn't feel like a jarring cut here. A lot of the edit was just making sure that sounds and music and different, like, cuts sounded natural, and that there wasn't, like, this jarring glitch in the audio or whatever that just clearly shows that I cut. And I didn't always do a perfect job. As you're watching this, you probably are like, hey, that sounded a little unnatural here and there, but it did as best as I felt I could do right now, and as I said, this is something that I consistently revisit and try and improve on as I develop it over the years. So this is where it cuts back again. And again, I loved how the music just hands back and forth between these two scenes. Like I said, it's like they were meant to be put next to each other, because I think they were. So I let this bit with Ahsoka play out. Love this scene, this little emotional bit. And then right as she turns back to here, right before she gets her, she senses Anakin's turn and Order 66, I cut away so that we can come back to that later. So then I let this whole bit play out, everything with Anakin here, Mace Windu's fight. This, I don't think anything in here should be cut away from. It's all important enough to linger on for as long as it plays out. Let this happen, and then right as Yoda senses it, and all of this happens, this is when I come back to Ahsoka sensing it, to kind of make sure that these two timelines are still tied together properly. So that's that piece. It's pretty brief, but I think it's important to have it placed here. And I think it's also it adds an extra little bit of emotional weight to have Ahsoka's line right here, her simple Anakin line, bleed right into the March on the Jedi Temple. And this is just another example of how these two stories, when placed in the right places, can they just help each other out so much and just bolster the narratives of each other. So I'll let this one play. It really is so hard to watch Revenge of the Sith or Clone Wars on their own now after this. It's something that I'd like to revisit at some point to see what these felt like on their own again, because it's been a few years since I've watched them on their own, but it really is just so cool to watch these combined. So I let Order 66 play out in full. I know that some people like to, I think a lot of editors that I've seen do this type of stuff, they like to have the Rex Order 66 scene play out with the music from Order 66 and just kind of have them all feed together into the montage. I don't think that my way is necessarily the best or that it's like objectively better. I just personally think that this scene was so intentionally created to be like powerful in its silence and in like the tension that it builds from that. These Order 66 scenes feel so important because of the music. They feel more emotional. It's like a very like, pulls on your heartstrings type of montage. And the music fades out whenever we get to the Yoda bit because he's the most important character who's going through this that we see right now. And then I also think that that holds true for Ahsoka, where I feel like after the musically scored emotional montage, I think that having it be more quiet and more personal, letting Ahsoka's moment breathe is the best way to do this. Especially, it just feels like a disservice to me to take away from the incredible sound design and lack thereof that this scene has. So I'll let this transition play here.
Execute Order 66.
Yes, Lord Sidious.
Rex, it's Anakin.
So that's where I have that cut. And then I jump ahead to cutting back to the Jedi Temple right at this moment, right as Ahsoka escapes, to kind of keep these parallel stories in sync with each other. So this is another moment where I think I differ greatly from other people that have done fan edits like this. From a lot of the stuff that I've seen, people tend to let Ahsoka's storyline on the ship play out in full before getting back to everything that Yoda and Obi-Wan and Anakin are doing. And I think that's because timeline-wise, that might be how it actually is. I'm not 1,000,000% sure on that one. But I don't think there's anything that indicates that it is 100% timeline accurate. And I think for the sake of pacing and the tone and consistency and keeping these narratives like just going at the same time, which makes the film stronger in my opinion, I keep Ahsoka's story playing out all the way until almost the entire end of the end of the entire film. So I know that like I think in one of the edits that I saw, the scene where she melts all of the clone helmets on like the poles and everything, the burying the dead scene, that takes place right before Yoda and Obi-Wan even get to the Jedi Temple to go intercept the transmission, which is, in my opinion, that's a pretty big disservice to how this can play out, because all of this later, having Anakin and Obi-Wan's duel, Yoda and Sidious's duel, and then Ahsoka and Rex escaping Order 66, having all of those play out at the same time is so much more epic, so much more engaging, so much more tonally consistent and paced well, and it just feels like the film, both storylines, both parallel storylines, play out where they should, and there's no moment where you feel like you got a sense of closure from one story. All of them close out at the same time. It's not like Ahsoka and Rex's and Maul's stories close out, and then you keep watching the other ones and don't revisit them. So that's my justification behind that, and hopefully, as you watch this and you see where I put everything together, you'll see more of what I'm talking about here. So that was where I cut that. I let Organa escape here, and then I cut back to Ahsoka's story here. Skipping ahead a little, I let this whole bit play out. She rescues Maul, and then right as they depart, I jump back to Obi-Wan here. And then skipping ahead here. There's not really too much to add about a lot of these segments. It's just kind of just keeping the tone, keeping the pacing consistent. This is just kind of the reasoning behind almost every cut in this section. I guess, again, to highlight how the two narratives, when placed next to each other in this way, can kind of feed off of each other. Obviously, all the clones are literally looking for Maul right here, talking about finding Ahsoka, talking about finding Maul, and then when we cut, they're all talking about finding Obi-Wan. And so it's just more parallels, more consistency, and just keeping it feeling like it's all supposed to be connected, because I know that jumping between a TV show in animation and a movie in live action, there is that, obviously, that tendency to make them not feel like they're completely connected in the right way, and this keeps it from feeling disjointed by cutting them in these kind of places where thematically the same things are happening. So then I jump back to Clone Wars again at this bit. And then let that play out. Cut back again here. And then this is where, let's see, there's like a little bit of a difference between how I've seen this edited. I have moved this around in a lot of places, and it's been differently structured a few times, because obviously this scene is great to have play out in full, where he comes in and attacks everybody, and also having it take place at the same time as the attack on the Jedi Temple and Palpatine's speech and all that. It's kind of like there's so many different storylines happening at the same time that it's a little weird to put them all together. I think I found the right way to do it, but I'm always open to suggestions, so if anyone who's watching this says, hey, that looks kind of weird where you put that, please let me know. I'm always open to adjusting this. So I'm going to let this part play out. Okay, so I let the whole Ahsoka and Rex bit play out here. And then this is where I officially close out part 3 of this edit, right where the actual Clone Wars series closed it out, because I feel like this cliffhanger just has to be left where it is. I feel like it's just like cutting right back to Revenge of the Sith here would just totally eliminate the power of this cutting to black. So I'll let this play out. Okay, so skipping ahead a little bit, I let Rex and Ahsoka go down this hall, and then I cut back to... Actually, I don't remember what I cut back to. The Jedi Temple, that's right. With Obi-Wan and Yoda. So this plays out, and then we start on Palpatine's speech, and then right at the same time, I think it is really, really powerful to have Sidious's speech play out at the same time that Maul is attacking the hyperdrive room. I don't remember if I had this set this way originally, but I saw someone online talking about how the Maul scene here is like borderline metaphorical in the way that it's a Sith Lord inside a vehicle that is literally a symbol of the Republic, and he is tearing it apart from the inside. And I just feel like because of that, and because of the way that it just like, this is such an epic thing that's happening at the same time as this epic thing, I feel like putting these together is just more tonally, just like I've talked about, like they feed into each other and they make each other more powerful and more thematic. So I'll let this transition play. So that's that one. Clone Wars plays out here with the whole hyperdrive room attack. And then I cut back to Revenge of the Sith with Anakin here, who is also tearing down the Separatists at the same time that Maul is tearing down this part of the Republic, at the same time that Sidious is tearing down the Republic, and it is just so many big thematic things happening at the same time that I feel like need to be placed in a certain distance of each other. I let that bit play out, more of Anakin, more of Palpatine, and then I jump back right after the end of Sidious's speech here, where he raises his arms, and then the end of all of the Separatists officially. I think so. I don't think it cuts back to that later. Yeah, so these two storylines conclude, and then we are seeing Padme literally say that democracy has fallen apart, at the same time that Anakin has completely dismantled the opposition in the Clone Wars to the Republic, and right at that moment, I cut back to this big Republic cruiser, this, like, obviously beacon of the Republic, coming out of light speed just in complete disrepair. So then, going a little further, I let this bit play out, they go into the hyperdrive room, and then I cut back to the Jedi Temple so that we can stay on top of what's happening with Obi-Wan and Yoda, since it had been a little bit since their story was shown. That's another thing that was really tricky to balance with all of this, is making sure that certain parts of the story weren't ignored for too long, because it feels like it can be easy to, with so many different things going on, cut away from certain characters for too long, and then you come back and it's like, oh yeah, these guys. So that was something that also influenced a few decisions here. So then, with this going on, I cut back to Clone Wars here. This whole bit with Maul is shown just to keep these two happening around the same time, and because this jump, there's like a little gap here where instead of having it be a scene with Obi-Wan and Yoda and then another scene with Obi-Wan and Yoda with just like a little gap between it, I threw in a Clone Wars scene so that this transition between this and this feels more natural.
I have recalibrated the code warning all surviving Jedi.
Then I let all of this play out, and right as... Let me just make sure that I'm remembering exactly what happens after this. Yeah, right as they talk about who's going to go fight who, and they learn obviously the terrible truth about Anakin, I chose to cut right back to this really big, thunderous moment with Ahsoka and the horrible situation that they find themselves in.
What do you mean the hyperdrive is offline? Destroyed. It's complete.
And this is kind of another thing that I feel like I should add that's very important, is talking about pacing and tonal consistency. The really big thing to preserve in this edit, especially with the energy that Revenge of the Sith had and the energy that the Clone Wars finale had, is this energy of never letting up, never letting the audience breathe, never just having a moment of calm, always making sure that something insane is going on, that the plot is just consistently leveling up, and that at no point does it feel like Clone Wars maybe is showing us something less important, and then Revenge of the Sith is more important, and then Clone Wars is more important, but then Revenge of the Sith takes it back a step. I want it to always feel like every single beat is consistently leveling up the depth of the plot and the stakes and everything that's going on, that it's getting more and more dire and more horrible. So having it be like going from, obviously, the hyperdrive came offline, younglings are dead, and then discovering that they're going to have to go fight Anakin and Sidious, and then on top of that, that doesn't feel bad enough, then it's like, okay, now Ahsoka and Rex are hurtling towards their deaths. And so it's just thing after thing after thing. And I cut through here, right as Maul shows up, back to Obi-Wan informing Padme about all of this. So let me show that. So I let this whole scene play out. She goes to find Anakin, Sidious gives his message, and then right as she arrives here, this is where the true, like, third act, like, climactic moments of all of this actually finally kicks in, where it felt like everything before this is, like, kind of third act, kind of second act, kind of territory between that. But right here, right as Padme arrives with Obi-Wan is where the third act officially kicks off, and so I wanted it to be paired with the moment where the third act kicks off for Ahsoka and Rex. So right here as she's landing, I cut to them in the hangar again.
Any luck with those doors?
And the shuttle?
Okay, so then I let this bit play out, the last bit of conversation, last bit of kind of like somber, slower conversation that takes place before everything goes to hell. This plays out, and then right as all the action happens in Clone Wars, I cut right back to Revenge of the Sith, where all of the action is about to start in Revenge of the Sith. So now Clone Wars has officially just kicked off, and Revenge of the Sith is about to kick off into its third act with the fight between Anakin and Obi-Wan, as well as also obviously having the Yoda and Sidious stuff in here. So all this plays out, these two fights officially get going, so we have two lightsaber duels happening at the same time as now Ahsoka and Rex trying to escape the Republic cruiser as it's about to crash into a moon. So we have these three big third acts, big final fights, all happening at the same time, which I have been told in the past that this feels like maybe it's a little bit too crazy, a little too big. And I know that, like, when you watch Revenge of the Sith, it feels like the final act is, I mean, it feels like it's way too crazy. Like, it feels like everything with Anakin and Obi-Wan is too long, the fight is too long, it's too much. But that's because, obviously, there's not enough emotional weight to it, there's not enough connection to the plot for it to feel like that grand of a finale was earned. And so I feel like not only with having all of the Clone Wars series built up to it, it makes Revenge of the Sith finale feel more earned, but having it be a 4-hour movie, like having this be the finale to a 4-hour movie, it feels like it does need to be something on this scale. So if this was still like a 2.5 hour movie, I feel like, yeah, maybe this would be too big of a finale. But considering we are over 3 hours into the film, and everything that has happened has been so massive, and it is like the climactic, like, conclusion to basically a 7-season TV show as well, this feels very appropriate to me, and I feel like it is actually better to have this feel so overwhelming. So here, I'll just show all the parts where I cut between these two fights. Or 3 fights, I guess. So a lot of these are very quick cuts. I think that this is also what Lucas did with the cuts between Yoda and Sidious and Anakin and Obi-Wan, is that since we're in this insane non-stop action of a finale, there's no more time for wipes, and it's just quick cuts and quick moments, and sometimes it's a little jarring, but a lot of these actually, like, some of these even felt jarring in the original Revenge of the Sith that didn't have Clone Wars, so. So there Maul escapes, and then we cut back to this kind of final piece of Yoda and Sidious's fight, and this is where I felt it was appropriate to have each of these fights bow out in a certain order. Obviously, in the original movie, Yoda and Sidious's fight ends before Obi-Wan and Anakin's fight ends, and so it felt like that needed to end first in this one as well, and because in the context of Clone Wars, it feels like Ahsoka and Rex are more important, at least to this narrative, than Yoda is. And so I kind of had Yoda and Sidious's fight bow out a little earlier than the others, giving more time to focus on these other two plots that are going on. So that's where I cut for that one. Let this play out for a little, and then cut back here. And then there is this little bit of slowdown, just a little bit of chance for the audience to breathe, even if it's just like for a minute, where Sidious is looking for Yoda.
Lord Vader is in danger.
So that's where that one cuts, and then it cuts again here. Let this fight play out more. Let Yoda officially escape here. And so now we are just exclusively on these two plot lines between Ahsoka and Rex and Obi-Wan and Anakin. So then I have that cut here. And then, obviously, the real main focus of all of this is Anakin and Obi-Wan, so that one needs to end last. So right before the last bit of their fight, I let the Clone Wars ending piece here play out. So now at this point, Yoda has gotten away, Ahsoka and Rex have gotten away, Maul has gotten away, Sidious is on his way to go find Anakin, and we can really focus on the last piece of this fight, the most important piece of this fight, which is Anakin fighting Obi-Wan. So I let this whole piece play out. All of this. And then from here, I think it's just a lot of Revenge of the Sith. That's right. There's a little bit here before. That's right. Okay. So I guess I didn't label this bit as yellow, but before going to Revenge of the Sith, it's not really an epilogue, but like all of its closing pieces, I wanted to let the burying the dead scene play out. So it feels like Anakin has been charred, Obi-Wan is getting away, Yoda's gotten away, Sidious is looking at his apprentice, and it feels like this is the moment to really let everything just fully break your heart. And so I did this really slow transition towards the burying the dead scene here. And then right at the end of all of this, if I'm remembering correctly, this is where I close out the fourth part of this movie right here. So when it comes back in, this is almost exclusively Revenge of the Sith territory. I let all of this play out, and then I also, another thing that I borrowed from the Madman's Knowledge edit is this, he did this really cool thing where he called Part 5 A New Hope, which I just like. It's maybe not the best thing, but I personally think it's really great. And so this last chunk after Part 4 ends, Clone Wars bows out for, like, I think there's only one more Clone Wars scene, and then everything is just kind of like epilogue material. And so he gave it this cool little Part 5 brief. I think this one is only like 10-15 minutes as a part. It's really small compared to the rest, but this is just our closing chapters. So this all plays out. This is all Revenge of the Sith. I didn't mess with anything in here. And then I do cut back to Clone Wars last. So Revenge of the Sith plays out And I've gotten some feedback from certain people saying that it's better to let Revenge of the Sith's ending be the final ending for this whole movie, but I think that Clone Wars serves as a better ending because part of what makes all of this so powerful is that it is a tragedy and that it is like this horrible, heartbreaking conclusion to the Clone Wars side of Star Wars before going into the original trilogy. And I think with Revenge of the Sith, having it end with the Star Wars themed fanfare is perfect. But when you combine these two, I think that ending with Clone Wars is much better because it leaves you on such a more hopeless note of just everything is over, everything has been lost, and it feels so much more fitting to me. So I let the Revenge of the Sith bit play out here, but I don't cut to credits here, I just have it cut to black.
May the Force be with you. Always.
And then when it comes back in, I let the last bit of this storyline play out with Clone Wars. So all of this here is it's just the very end of everything. And this is our final shot, which I think is perfect. So yeah, that's what I have for my Clone Wars and Revenge of the Sith edit. I want to go back and just point out a couple tiny things that I added that I skipped over because I wanted to talk about the pacing and the cuts between the story first, but there are 4 or 5, I think 5 points where I made slight changes to the movie to enhance certain moments, either for continuity or just because there's something that I don't necessarily think was the strongest way to depict the story. So let me see. The first one that I already mentioned the elevator bit, so I don't need to mention that one again. The first one, I believe the first one is with Grievous, actually. And I forgot to mention this when I was going through it. Yeah, so when Obi-Wan finds Grievous, there is this... Where is it? Is it in here? I think it's around here. Yeah, it's right here. So there's this moment where in the original, this made, perfect sense that Grievous pulls out all his lightsabers and he's basically like, hey, you're stupid. I know how to use a lightsaber. I was trained by Dooku. And in the original film, it was like, oh, cool. Why would Obi-Wan know that? But now that Clone Wars is out, it's kind of one of those things where it's like, oh, this is a continuity error. And it's weird because Lucas himself oversaw Clone Wars, and so it's just strange that these two met so many times in the Clone Wars, and they fought so many times in the Clone Wars. And so Obi-Wan is very, very aware that Grievous knows how to wield lightsabers and fight in this manner. So this is just the thing that I did for consistency. It really is not that big of a deal, but it just always bothered me, is I went in, and you can't see the evidence of it on the timeline now because I lost so many of the files, but I went in and I pulled out the audio, found the music separate, put the music back in the muted clip, found noise of like battle droids, found mechanical clanking noises for Grievous. I found like a cloak, like whoosh noise. I found the lightsaber hum, and I added all of those individual music pieces and sounds, as well as like a little cough growl kind of noise for Grievous that came from the Clone Wars. And I put it all in here so that instead of saying, hey, I've been trained by Dooku, he just says his line of "you fool," and then he does like a growl, and then they get to fighting. Just to remove that little moment of him being like, hey, I know how to fight, because it really does not make sense in the context of Clone Wars. So I'll just show this real quick. Oh, let's back that up a little bit so you can hear the full start of it.
I will deal with this Jedi slime myself.
Your move.
You fool!
So that's what I did for that there. And then later on, there was another moment that I made an adjustment to. Just going to skim through here to find it so I make sure I'm not missing anything. Let's see, where is that at? Oh, I think it's a little further. Yeah, so it takes place, that's right, it takes place in the actual conflict of everything here. So, whenever they're all fighting, it was the Yoda bit. That's what I want to find. Okay, I started looking way too early in all of this. I thought there was something else in there, but I guess there wasn't. So, whenever Yoda escapes, there's this bit that always bothered me, where he basically just says, like, hey, I lost, I'm gonna go into exile, I failed. And it's just like, I mean, I guess he doesn't say the exile bit, but it's just like, it's really, it just feels very out of character for Yoda, it feels very defeatist, and it just doesn't make much sense to me. So I think the scene works so much better if you literally just cut it. So whenever Yoda is escaping here, instead of having him say this line to Organa, I literally just have him hop down and the ship flies away, and it's just like, he can talk more later about why he left, but instead of saying immediately after losing, hey, I lost, I gotta, I failed. So here, I'll just play this bit here. I think that works a lot better. I don't know if it's necessarily the best, but for me, it works better. So, I'll show the other thing that I added here, and this I talked about in my last video that I made in a little more detail than maybe I'll go into here, and nobody agrees with me, except, like, I think I have, like, one friend of mine agrees that this is a good change, and I will die on this hill that this was a good thing to add, or a good thing to change, I guess, but I changed the bit with the high ground here because it has always irked me that this fight is, like, one of the best choreographed in film, it's one of the most, like, epic in scale, and it is just so over the top in so many regards, and obviously Anakin and Obi-Wan are doing just insane stuff. They're, like, flying around on these, like, things that float on lava, and, like, earlier they're swinging from ropes and jumping off of this molten lava, exploding, like, falling down a lava waterfall thing, lava fall, I guess, all of this stuff. And it's very clear that they are both incredibly powerful, incredibly talented, and they just do the most insane things that you see in Star Wars in order to fight each other. And then all of a sudden there's this moment, and I hate this moment so much, where Obi-Wan jumps onto a little hill, and he just, for no apparent reason at all, and I don't care if it was explained in books or comics or anything, I don't care at all, because none of that was explained here, so it doesn't count. He just jumps on this hill, and he goes, hey, Anakin, the fight's over because I'm on a hill. He's like, you can't possibly beat me, I'm on a hill now. And I just, like, I hate the high ground line. Because why in the world would suddenly being on a hill mean that this fight is over in this way? Like, it literally, no matter which way you look at it, even if you try and, like, read into the implications that some people claim there is from previous movies and the context of the trilogy, none of that groundwork is laid low enough for this scene to make sense. This scene it just feels so, like, borderline childish in the way that these characters talk to each other, and so I just went in and I completely cut it. So, instead of having him jump on the hill and say, it's over, I have the high ground, he just says, it's over, which is left a little bit more ambiguous. It's just kind of it just works more for me without him giving the reason that I have the high ground, and then it lets Anakin say his line. So I'll just let this play, and I know the vast majority of people watching this video are not going to agree with me at all, but I will stand by this. So here is this bit.
It's over, Anakin! You underestimate my power! Don't try it!
And just looking at that, I realized that there is a little, if you notice it here, a little glitch in the frames.
It's over, Anakin!
See how it, like, starts a little bigger here? Let me see. Yeah, it's, like, insanely small. I'll fix that another time. Anyway, That's what I did there, because it just feels like it fixes a really goofy moment at the end of this fight. Like, I'm so emotionally invested in this fight. It's so gripping, it's so climactic, it's so intense, and then it's just like this dumb line is said. So I just took it out. So if anybody decides to make their own edits in any similar way to mine after this, feel free to not do this part, but I'm always going to have that part included. So the last bit that I added in here, I think this is the only other thing I have to say, is the scene with Vader screaming no. Obviously, pretty much nobody likes this bit. This is such a cartoonish scream. And so I went in and I actually pulled audio from a different movie, and also not a very good movie, King Arthur, Legend of the Sword. I think it was released around like 2017. It's not very good, but it has a very, very well-performed scream in it from the main villain. And so what I did is I just went in, grabbed that audio, ran it through a voice modulator to make it have like a deeper pitch. I made it sound more like Darth Vader. And then I removed the audio from this part, put the music back in, and then threw in that new scream that I created. And I think that it is another moment, just like the high ground line, where you have this amazing emotional scene that is completely undercut by a just incredibly goofy decision. And so right here, I'll just let this play out. And I think this is a much better scream than the one that the original film has. So here's this bit. Anyway, I think that's a lot better. So, yeah, I think that's pretty much it. I don't think I have anything else to say here. Yeah, that is I guess that's my whole 4-hour cut. If you're interested in making your own and you want to use any of this as a guide or a reference, that's kind of why I threw this in there, to give more of a hands-on look at how it was all made and where I did all the individual cuts. Seriously, if you decide to do something like this, or if you disagree with anything in here, I would really love to know, because I am always updating this and always changing it, and I have found a few flaws in it over the years. And so if you notice anything, whether it is an audio hiccup or a little like mistake in the timeline or anything like that, please let me know. If you make your own, please let me know. Anything like that. I just really love the idea of a 4-hour supercut of these two storylines, and I love seeing all the different ways that people do it. So that's what I have for this. And next, I would like to hop over to talking about my Return of the Jedi edit. So this is still, as I mentioned, an edit that I am very much in the weeds with. It's not something that is nearly as fleshed out as my Revenge of the Sith and Clone Wars edit. So there's a few spots in here where I won't have direct on-screen examples of what I'm trying to do to improve this film, but I can still talk about what I'm doing. So really, there's not even much to talk about, because as I said, a lot of the problems with this film either can't be fixed or are insignificant enough that they're fine as is. So everything here I left pretty much the same. This opening bit, I think this is one of the only opportunities that there is for tightening the pacing of this movie. I think that it could be beneficial to just have 3PO and R2 enter the palace, meet with Bib Fortuna, and then cut all the way from that point up until Leia appears with Chewie. And that way you just kind of get rid of them being processed, meeting with Jabba, and the entire dance sequence, which are just sequences which, while fun, kind of drag the pacing out a little bit, like I talked about earlier. From there, there's really not much that I would adjust here, because a lot of these things, like any movie, each one feeds into the next one, and even if they're not the most amazing scenes you've ever seen, they still are relevant and important enough that they have to be included in some regard. I think that there's probably in this chunk some things that, whether or not you cut entire scenes, whether or not I cut entire scenes, I guess, I would maybe cut little pieces of it. I feel like the scene where Leia meets Wicket is one that, while it needs to be here to show how she meets the Ewoks, is probably a little longer than it should be just as a scene, and so maybe a couple moments in here could be trimmed just to kind of speed this along a little bit, because this is where the plot obviously starts to get really, really slow. Besides that, a lot of this, it kicks off pretty quickly into the stuff with Luke and Vader, and this is obviously essential. So, obviously the bulk of the stuff that I added is right in here. This bit after Luke meets the Emperor, the attack on the Death Star, and the rebels get attacked. So as I mentioned before, this is the bit where they're all captured, and then the Ewoks show up and lead some of the stormtroopers away, and this whole fight kicks off. So I left this little part where they just shoot some arrows and they just cause a distraction, causing the rebels to be able to enter the fight. That's all I left in. And then if you look here, where all these little cuts are, this is where I removed pieces of Ewoks fighting. So in between, I'll just let this play while I talk. In between every single part here, there would have been Ewoks fighting. So as you see, there's like shots of the rebels fighting, and there's shots of the Ewoks getting shot at or running away. But there is not actually any moments at all of Ewoks like crushing ATSTs with logs, or tripping stormtroopers, or jumping on them, or anything like that. It's just this kind of stuff. And I feel like it makes this all not only just more believable, but more exciting, more intense, and just really makes this feel like a better finale than it did before. And it puts all of the emphasis on the rebels. The rebels are saving the day, and it makes Han and Leia and Chewie feel more heroic than if they were just kind of standing around by this big door while Ewoks were saving the day. So skipping ahead, that's pretty much, honestly, that's like the biggest change that I made to this movie. There's not too much here. It's really just, yeah, here's more of this kind of stuff. Just cutting around Ewoks doing things. And then letting all this play out. As you can see, I'm still showing that Ewoks are getting attacked, but I'm not necessarily leaving in them attacking. I cut a little bit of this part here to make the part with Chewie entering the ATST a little bit more believable. Not believable, I guess, but a little less goofy is what I should have said. Because this part always struck me, especially with this little Tarzan yell that he does, it just feels very, very strange and a little bit childish. So aside from that, where's the part that I added in the enhanced deleted scene? Here it is. So this is where I restored the deleted scene, where they wait for these guys to open the blast doors, and I cut right before you see people come out of here. So it just looks like these doors opened, and then they enter the bunker, and this entire fight kicks off. And it's not the most well-restored scene ever, because I'm not the best editor in the entire universe, but I think that this is serviceable enough that it gives Han and Chewie more of a hero moment in all of this. So I let this whole bit play out. I do need to come back and do some extra color correcting here and restoring later on, but as of now, this is what I have. And then from here, I pretty much just let the entire rest of the movie play out, because it's just, from here, it's pretty much fantastic, and there's not much else to do. And the only other thing that I added is I restored the original Anakin, because I don't like Hayden Christensen in this bit. I think that he just makes a very weird face. I think most people agree that he makes a very weird face in this scene, and it's a lot more, it just makes a lot more sense, and it's a lot more appropriate, especially from Luke's point of view, to see older Anakin, a face that he actually recognizes. So I left that part in, and then, yeah, I think that's it for this one. This is a really clean, simple edit. There's not much to do here. It's just patching things up in a few places. I will say, in the edit that I'm working on adding things later, things that I haven't gotten to yet and that I'm not even able to finalize yet because there isn't enough footage yet to do it, I am trying to, at least I'm testing out the possibility of improving this little montage bit, because it's very brief, and as I talked about, I feel like Return of the Jedi wraps up really quickly, and so as Disney has been releasing just this endless just barrage of new content, even though I don't like the new content they're making, they are in a way giving me scenes that I can potentially use to improve certain edits. And something that I would like to do is, or at least try to do, because I don't know if it's going to pay off, I don't know if it's going to be too weird looking or jarring or take away from the power of this individual movie, but I would like to try my hand at putting in some moments with Clone Wars characters in this montage. One that I think really could work here is the last scene in the Ahsoka series, where Ahsoka sees Anakin Skywalker's ghost. I just feel like putting this in here in this montage, just to cut away to her really briefly, haven't seen her since the end of the Clone Wars, it could be a pretty emotional moment in this big montage to see Ahsoka also get to reunite with Anakin, one of the other major characters, like Ahsoka being one of those other major characters that we haven't gotten to see in a while, who's pretty important, but feels a little bit left behind. And I would like to do the same type of stuff with characters like Maul and Rex and Bo-Katan. I just feel like having a brief montage that shows us the characters that were kind of left behind in all of this and showing where they're at the end of all this could be a slightly more satisfying way to build out the finale of the whole story, even if it's not completely necessary. So, like I said, that is completely me just experimenting and testing things out. It's not locked in. It's not something I'm 100% going to do with my edit, but it is just something that I'm playing with and that I feel like could improve the story in some capacity. So that's what I got for this. So the third thing that I wanted to go over in this unscripted part of the video is my personal Clone Wars viewing guide. I know that there are literally tons of these things online, and so I'm not going to even dare say that mine is the best. I think it's pretty good, but is it the best? I don't know. Everyone kind of has their own way of doing things. I just thought that it would be relevant to share the one that I work with. So I made mine trying to mostly keep in mind filler, non-filler, good episodes, bad episodes, and then acknowledging that sometimes good episodes can be technically filler and sometimes bad episodes can have stuff that you need to watch. So I color-coded this entire thing to indicate that. Yellow stuff is what I said is kind of like good episodes, stuff that you'll probably enjoy, but if you skip them, you're going to be completely fine. There's not really anything important in them. Green stuff is things that I consider almost completely essential. I don't think that any of these should be skipped. Red is stuff that I think has absolutely no value to anybody that's watching it, whether it's your first time or your repeat viewing. I just don't think it should be included at all. And then orange is this really annoying middle ground where the episode or whatever is pretty terrible, but it might still include something, whether big or small, pretty relevant to the overall plot. This is a good example, this little two-parter. This episode here is perfectly fine on its own. I think this one's pretty fun. And this one has a couple fun moments in it, but because it's a two-parter, and because of what this one is mostly about, it is just, I cannot stand these two episodes. And it introduces Hondo and his kind of whole character dynamic, which ends up being kind of important later. Hondo is obviously not extremely important, but he is important enough that you maybe should see his introductory episode and how the main characters come to know him. But at the same time, like, this is a Jar Jar episode, and it's just so bad. So, I don't know, the orange stuff is just like, if you do skip it, you won't actually miss too much. It just might be like someone says something or a character shows up and it's like, wait, I don't completely remember exactly what this is, but you'll be fine. I usually skip these episodes, and sometimes when I show people Clone Wars, I skip these episodes because they're just not that good. So yeah, with that being said, I'm just kind of going to go through this list. I don't really think there's a need to point out every single part of this. I'll just highlight a few standout things that I think are pretty relevant to mention. Firstly, you'll see that I started with this half green, half yellow first 30 minutes of the Clone Wars movie. This is because since the Clone Wars movie was originally meant to be a series of episodes, and then they just smashed them all together to make a movie, I think that the first 20-ish, 30-ish minutes of the Clone Wars movie serve as a pretty good first episode to the Clone Wars, especially because it introduces Ahsoka in a way that I really like, and it has kind of the first few moments with Rex. So, character-wise, it's a pretty good starting point. But I also have it as half yellow because not only is it not really a good episode, even if you just treat it as its own episode, it's not really a good episode, but it's also extremely annoying to go into a full-length movie to just isolate a small chunk of it before watching a TV show. It's really impractical. Someday I'm going to try and get my hands on just this little chunk and just edit it into its own little piece for myself. Aside from that, I think there's nothing too big to mention here. I have a few of these as green, that's something I should mention, that aren't plot essential, but are character essential. Lara Grievous is a one that I think represents this perfectly. This is an episode that if you skip it, you are going to miss literally nothing. It has nothing to do with the plot at all. But it is pretty much one of the only episodes that focuses on Kit Fisto, who is obviously a character that dies in Order 66, and if you don't watch any content with him in Clone Wars, there's no reason to care about him when he dies. So certain episodes like this one, not essential to the plot, but I think it just adds a level of emotion to things that happen later on in the saga. So that's why some of these are green that maybe you might look at and go, why do you have that one as green? So, let's see. Yeah, that's most of season 1. I'm just kind of going to go through, just scroll through this, and if I see anything that I want to point out, I'll point it out. But I don't think that anybody really needs me to go through every single episode, because I imagine most people watching this video have probably already watched Clone Wars and Star Wars and all of that, and so there's no reason for me to list everything individually. I'll also note real quick, these little blue and pink things, I don't think I have them on every single arc, but they're supposed to indicate which episodes are an arc. This is just for myself, in case anyone was curious. Let's see. I know there was another part of this that I wanted to highlight. Oh, there it is. So I have these little asterisks next to 2 of the Mortis episode arcs. Whenever I was watching through Clone Wars with my girlfriend, I was debating over whether I should show her the entire Mortis arc or not, because it is one of my favorite arcs. I think it's phenomenal, and I think that everybody who likes Star Wars should see it. But I don't actually think the entire arc is good for a first-time watch, especially if you're going in somewhat chronological order. And so I kind of decided that since my girlfriend didn't know anything about Star Wars, we would only watch the first episode of this arc, because it has a pretty conclusive ending, and you don't actually need the other 2. And then whenever she is done with Clone Wars later on, we're probably going to go watch these 2 later. But just as a first-time watch, I feel like these 2, they just spoil too much. Like, I think these 2 really foreshadow really, really heavily, and they basically just kind of ruin everything that's coming up for someone who maybe doesn't know what's coming up. So, that's just, I don't know. If you ever plan to watch Star Wars with someone, that's just my recommendation, is just skip these 2 the first time around, and then if you ever watch it with them again, add these 2 in, because they are really great. Other than that, I don't think there's anything on my list worth pointing out. Yeah, I love that, as I do this every single time, I love how much more green there is the further in you get. Oh, I want to point out this one. This is another arc, these 4 here, that I personally think only the first episode is needed. I love this episode, The Gathering, about the young Jedi that go in and get their kyber crystals. Great episode. One of my favorites. And then the other 3 is just like, it feels like it kind of dilutes this episode, because this one just feels like such a strong standalone. And then these 3, I haven't watched them in a while, but if I remember correctly, it's literally just like Grievous trying to take their lightsabers, and then Hondo shows up, and Ahsoka has to fight pirates and Grievous, and it just feels like a lot of time wasting. It is a really big filler arc that I just feel like kind of takes away from what made this one special on its own. So that's just my recommendation, but by no means are these bad episodes. I just don't personally like them. I think that's pretty much it. I have these episodes as orange because I don't really think any of them are particularly great, but they do add like a little bit of character development. So, maybe as I'm looking at this, I should make them green. I haven't actually updated this list in a little while. I did a couple weeks ago, but I feel like after making this video and having just watched Star Wars again, they should probably be green. So, anyway, that is my entire list. I also have these ones as this weird blue color just because I have my 4-hour cut that I use to watch Clone Wars, and so I don't really watch these ones on their own anymore. So, anyway, that's my list. If it's helpful, awesome. I hope it was. If not, then, that's totally fine. I genuinely love hearing every way that different people watch Clone Wars, so if you have a guide, or if you have recommendations for how to fix mine, or episodes that you're like, hey, why don't you watch that one? It's great. Maybe I'll revisit it. The very last thing that I want to show in this unscripted part of the video is just some stray ideas that I have for addressing the quality of The Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones. I know that I kind of said that it's pretty much unsalvageable, but I think that at the very least there are some things you can do to kind of lighten the effects of how bad these movies are. So I know a lot of people have done things like trimming certain scenes in them and cutting certain parts that most of us deem pretty bad, and that's definitely a great way to go with it. I think there's not really a wrong answer here, because since these movies are, at least in my opinion, so bad, I don't think that there is, as I've said a million times, there's not actually a way to fix these. These are not, it's not like you can turn The Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones into good movies that you enjoy watching. There's just not enough in them to make that happen. So I just think that there's kind of a situation where it's like, you just have to make it as good as you can, fix it for yourself as good as you can. Obviously, for some people, just watching The Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones is enough. Some people love them enough, and that's great. And if you do, that's awesome. I wish I was one of those people. So for some people, I guess there's not even a problem at all. I don't like them, and so I tried to come up with a way that I could make it a little more bearable for myself whenever I go back through, because despite how much I don't like these, when I do watch through this series, I do like to start at the very beginning and actually appreciate the whole story from start to finish. So this is not what I'm going to stick with forever, probably, because I don't know if it works that well, but it is the most recent little experiment, I guess, I did to try and make these more watchable, is I combined The Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones into one movie. And it's not flawless, but since I've already seen them in their entirety, and when I revisit the series, it's just about making sure I'm seeing the biggest pieces from each of them, and also that I am, like, saving time because I don't want to watch two massive movies that I hate. I kind of combine them into one movie that loses about an hour-ish of screen time and just makes it a more comprehensive, simple way for me to watch this, since I already know the story, and it just kind of... I've used the analogy that it's like kind of like an instruction manual. This feels like reading an instruction manual before you play a board game or a card game, where everything you're about to actually watch, Clone Wars, the original trilogy, all that stuff is fantastic. That's the actual stuff you're here to watch. It's great. And watching The Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones is kind of just like, you know, you got to read the rules first. You have to get the proper context for the story before you dive into the actual good stuff. So what I did for myself, this is just for me, I'm by no means recommending that anyone else experience Star Wars in this way. This is just me, you know, since it's my big Star Wars video, I just kind of wanted to talk about one other thing here that I'm just testing out, and that is combining these into one, and treating Attack of the Clones like the main movie, and The Phantom Menace as kind of the, not sub-movie, but it's the, not even B-story, I don't even want to say. It is the, I'm treating it as flashbacks, I guess. So let me just show. Maybe it's better if I just show. So I went in and I put in a new title crawl. I just call it The Phantom Menace because it's just episode 1 to me. I don't want it to be called Attack of the Clones and The Phantom Menace. So combined movie, just called The Phantom Menace. I feel like this title works very well for both of these movies. And then I just let Attack of the Clones play out. And what I did here is I created these little flashback moments. And again, I know this is probably going to be, so many people are going to look at this and say, oh my god, that's so insulting that you did that. Star Wars doesn't even have flashbacks. This is violating George Lucas's vision. But like I said, this is just a thing for me to be able to get through these movies when I watch the series and have it be in a more comprehensible, quicker way that hits all the same beats. So I did this thing where the plot of Attack of the Clones plays out, and then it does this, where it cuts to The Phantom Menace with a little bit of an altered saturation and treating it like it's a flashback. So let me just show this. It's not perfect, but let me just show what I'm at least working with.
Too sure of themselves they are. Even the older, more experienced ones.
Remember, Obi-Wan, if the prophecy is true, your apprentice is the only one who can bring the Force back into balance.
That's it. Tatooine. There's a settlement.
Land near the outskirts. We don't want to attract attention.
So again, this is not the cleanest editing in the entire world. It's not the best, like, font, it's not the best text, it's not the best sound effects. It is just, I literally made this, like, I think 2 months ago, just kind of a test run to see what this would look like. And I'm not absolutely in love with it, but I also don't hate it, and it was a bit more enjoyable, at least for me, to watch these than it was for me to watch them separately. Especially because I prefer to have the opener before Clone Wars be just one movie instead of two. So that's just a me thing, though. I also genuinely think that a ton of the Phantom Menace is just completely filler. Like, before they get to Tatooine, there's really not much in the story that I think is relevant overall. It's just kind of a lot of dicking around. And I think it's better if you just cut right to the actual action. So I just, in the middle of this, I cut to the first scene where they land on Tatooine. I threw this 10 years earlier text on the screen, and it is just now that we're playing out this real plot that's happening in real time in the present, and then as it's playing out and as things are being referenced and talked about, it cuts back to the moments that I think are relevant to what's going on in Attack of the Clones. And I tried to keep this fairly consistent the whole way through, in the same way that I was editing Revenge of the Sith. Not nearly as streamlined or paced well as Revenge of the Sith and Clone Wars, but it is an attempt. So, like, these kind of stories play out, and then it cuts back to show more of what's going on here. Let me see if there's some other good examples in here. I know there was one with, like, let's see, Anakin goes back to meet his mom here. Or to go back to find his mom, I should say. And then I have this whole storyline playing out with him leaving home. So at the same time that he's leaving his mother, I have him coming back to meet his mother. And it just feels like there is potential here for this to play out as something that is, like, well-paced and does work well, that these parallel stories that you're discovering what was happening in the present, what's happening in the present at the same time that you're discovering what happened in the past, and they kind of feed into each other, and by the time you reach the end of it all, you've got, like, this Anakin, like, this foreboding warning from Yoda about, like, hey, don't train Anakin, what's going to happen, and then we reach the end of this, and it's like, oh, here's where we ended up. Title, like, the ending credits roll, and then you lead into Clone Wars and the rest of the story. Again, I've said it a million times, it's not perfect, it is just an experiment, but it is something that I am just trying out to, I don't know, hopefully find a cooler way of going about all of this, at least for myself, because I somewhat enjoyed watching this, and I enjoyed it definitely more than watching the two movies as they stand on their own, and yeah. I don't know, so I think that's kind of all I have to say. I already gave my main concluding statements earlier in the video, because I didn't anticipate that everyone was going to want to watch this part of the video. I realized that having it start as a scripted video essay and then jumping to screen recorded, like, I'm just kind of winging it with everything that I'm saying. As you can hear, there's a lot more uhs and ums and all that. So yeah, there's not really a massive conclusive way to close out this video. I guess I just am, I'm really appreciative of everyone that watched this. I really enjoyed making this. I really enjoyed making the last video. The last video was kind of basically the things I said in this video, but way, way, way shorter and more condensed. It was kind of me thinking that I could just put this out there and it would be understood well enough on its own. And a lot of people had a lot to say, both positive and negative. There was a lot of great criticism. A lot of things in this video are a direct result of criticism that I got in the last one, really constructive, helpful criticism. And so, yeah, I just kind of wanted to make this for myself to flesh out everything that I feel about Star Wars. This is pretty much the comprehensive, entire, like, what Joseph thinks about Star Wars video. And yeah, I just really had a good time making it, and I extremely appreciate you taking the time to watch this. If you watched the last one and you came back and also watched this one, even more thanks. I really appreciate that as well. And yeah, I hope that at the very least you enjoyed. I hope that there's a few comments of, more constructive criticism, more feedback, more stuff like that. And I'm looking forward to making more things in the future. So this is a very sloppy, impromptu ending, but yeah, I just wanted to say thanks. So I appreciate you watching this.